Started here in about 30 seconds. Let's get started. Good morning, board. Thank you, everyone, for being here for this special meeting of the board. Today's September the 5th, and we'll have a few announcements here before we get started. First, for those that are joining us in the live webcast, the agenda may be found online at the KDE website. And I also want to thank our interpreters for supporting us, as well as our closed captioning support here this morning. There is an overflow room here just beyond room 516 for anyone that would like to head there. I'd also ask for any cell phones, if you have a cell phone, that this would be a great time to turn the ringtone off. Also we have a change in the appearance of the agenda from previous board meetings. And each agenda item in the future will be focused on one of the 7 points in the board's mission statement to try to bring some clarity to when we decided at the retreat and the meeting afterwards what our mission would be, how those points fit into the mission and be organized in that manner. So now, Marty, if we'd have a roll call, the members.
Ben Cundiff. Tracy Cusick.
Here.
Rich Gimmel.
Here.
Kathy Gornick.
Here.
Hal Heiner.
Here.
Gary Houchins.
Here.
Elisa Johnson.
Here.
Joe Papalia.
Here.
Milton Seymour.
Here.
Amanda Stamper.
Here.
Laura Timberlake.
Here.
And President King is not with us. However, I did just receive a note, Chair Heiner, that Vice President Aaron Thompson will be joining us soon.
Great.
You have a quorum, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Marty. We do have a quorum, and at this time, if you'd please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We'll now observe a minute of silence as we consider the weighty issues before us, issues that affect a high percentage of the children in the Commonwealth. Thank you. All right, short agenda today for the special meeting, but big topics nonetheless. So the first item, we'll have an update on the accountability performance standard setting from that committee. And I think with us today is Associate Commissioner Rhonda Sims, and also Brian Gong and Chris Domaleski from the Center for Assessment Facilitators.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Pleasure to be with you today. We have some work to report to you and some information to share about the standard setting work that occurred on August 22nd to be able to identify the schools in the bottom of performance for Kentucky and meet those federal requirements of CSI, and then eventually that cut score will be applied to TSI and other, if you're not either of those two designations. We have Brian Gong with the Center for Assessment and Chris Domaleski, who facilitated the work. It's a great pleasure to have Chairman Heiner and Gary Houchins, who served on the committee, so I'm sure they'll be adding perspectives as we go along today. But we wanted to start with really an overview of the process of how that worked, the background, kind of what put us on the path to have this particular kind of standard-setting activity. And obviously, we'll be looking for your action on this issue today and the approval of the cuts to move forward with reporting.
Rhonda, if you don't mind,
Sure.
just for people watching that may not be familiar with those acronyms, CSI
Sure,
and TSI.
sure,
would
absolutely.
you state what those are, just kind of
Absolutely.
a top line,
Absolutely.
couple sentence overview.
With the federal requirements for differentiating school performance are that we identify the schools that are in the bottom performance, and that is for comprehensive support and improvement. So that's the CSI. In addition, you're to take those same cut thresholds and apply it to the performance of all student groups throughout the Commonwealth. So really anywhere where you have more than 10 students in a content and a grade becomes a group that's reportable. We apply that cut to the TSI, that's targeted support and improvement. So it's looking very strictly this year at group performance. And then those are the two requirements federally. So that's what we are doing this year and what we've turned in the state plan. If you're not a CSI school or a TSI school, then you're considered other. And so schools will have one of those three designations, CSI, TSI, and other. And we have some slides to kind of walk through that background as well. But these are federally defined terms and expectations that all states should at least identify for. And again, it's about identifying for who should receive support and how. And then that becomes obviously a resource conversation for the board. Okay. Other clarifying things before we turn it over to Chris and Brian to lead us through a little bit of overview of the work that occurred on August 22nd.
So Rhonda, just to be clear
Sure.
for all of us, on the CSI, the CSI schools will be determined first.
Yes.
And then we will look, as required by federal law, at each student group. It might be students on free and reduced lunch. Or
That's
it might
right.
be by
Students with disabilities.
disabilities, by race.
Right.
We'll look at those student groups and compare, in all of the other schools,
That's right.
compare their results for that student group against the
cuts.
mean, for
The actual,
average.
the cuts, the thresholds that you'll look at a little bit later today. So that final cut number that we say, this is what's going to identify if you're at below this number in CSI, that same cut is applied to the performance of every student group across the state. And so that's a lot of groups of students, because anywhere where it's 10 or more in a grade or content.
So it's not just the average of the bottom
No.
5% for that particular student group.
It's
what
the
was
actual
determined, the cut score.
That's
So
right.
if you have students on free and reduced lunch, a school that maybe has very high proficiency on average, but students
right.
on free and reduced lunch fall below those
That is right.
cut scores, that school would receive additional support through targeted support for that student group.
That's right. They'd be designated for TSI, and then obviously there would need to be a conversation of what does that support look like as we move into this school year, because we're using 17-18 data to identify the terminology and the designation for the 18-19 school year, so this upcoming school year that we've just started. And so we're going to look through the process of how we created the cuts with the work of 15 quality Kentuckians, and then also how they will apply them. So I think we'll get into a lot of detail in the slides that'll help this conversation.
And this completely replaces the old priority school.
That's right. Priority
That
schools.
that is gone. And
That's
will be
right.
replaced with this to identify generally the bottom 5%.
That is absolutely right. So the lowest performing in the prior system federally was priority, and schools with that had group performance issues were called focus. So now those terminology, and there are some slight difference in the rules around it, and we'll talk about that as we go forward. The terminology now is CSI and TSI.
Thank you.
Moving forward. Thank you.
Is this presentation on the website?
It's not yet. We have it for you here today, and we'll post it, and Susan will do that for us after the meeting.
Okay,
But
thank you.
it's not on the web yet. We did provide for you in advance, however, the summary of the report, and we also provided you the staff note. And so really what you have in this PowerPoint is really just highlights and pulled for those two documents. But we'll post this as well. Okay, so I'm going to turn to Brian and Chris, and I'll have you walk us through this work.
Thank you. Good morning. Chris and I are going to present a summary of what the standard setting committee did, their recommendations, and then Interim Commissioner Lewis is going to present his own recommendations after that. So we will give some background and then the recommendations, and then turn it back to the department. As was being described, Kentucky is required to identify schools for comprehensive support and improvement and targeted support and improvement starting this fall. And the requirements are that at least 5%, so the bottom 5% of Title I schools must be identified for comprehensive support and improvement. Kentucky has decided that not only Title I schools, but also non-Title I schools that are that low performing would also be identified for comprehensive support and improvement. There's no set requirement for the number or amount of schools that would be identified for targeted support and improvement. The rule is that a school is identified for targeted support and improvement if it has at least one student group that is performing at the CSI level. So when the CSI level is determined, then as was discussed, the department does a data analysis to check every school, every student group that has a minimum number of students that makes it accountable, which is 10. So that you have to have at least 10 in the student group. If that student group is performing as low as the CSI threshold, then that school is identified for the group. A school could be identified for multiple groups. So the groups are students with disabilities, English learners, economically disadvantaged, racial ethnic groups, so African American, Caucasian, Hispanic, Asian Pacific Islander, and Native American, Alaskan Native. And many of those groups are so small in the state that schools actually don't have them. But there are many, most schools have multiple student groups, so they would be a candidate for
And Brian,
TSI.
just to clarify, white is one of the student groups as
Yes,
well.
yes, yeah,
right.
yeah. And Kentucky actually has created another composite student group called
Two or more.
Two or more, and then there's a multiple, which is a composite of student groups that may be too
Identify.
small on their own, but then they're put together
And
so that
consolidated.
they're a consolidated student group, so that the school is held accountable. So for example, if there were only 5 students with disabilities and 5 students who were economically disadvantaged, those 2 student groups would be too few. But when they're combined into the consolidated student group, that would hold the school accountable. So Kentucky is very serious about identifying possible achievement gaps for student groups. So those are the student groups that are candidates for TSI. You may remember that there was a very long procedure for coming up with a design of school accountability. It involved many committees and then came to the board, and the board approved the general design of that a while ago. So that included what counted, or what the indicators were, the general weights for them, which we'll review, and then a general design for putting the things together for accountability. And you'll remember that the board approved a more comprehensive design at the time, the 5-star system that was to designate schools from 1 to 5 stars. That 5-star system will take place next year, but not all the indicators were available this year, and the federal requirement, Kentucky would have rather waited till next year to implement the full system, but the federal requirement was that at least schools for CSI and TSI be identified for this year. And so this report is about identifying schools for comprehensive and targeted support. Although the board approved in their regulation the general design, the exact values, or what we're calling the threshold cut scores, needed to be established. And that is, what is the combination of scores that would qualify a school for comprehensive support and improvement? So the process that the board approved was took place is 3 steps. One is that there would be what we call a standard setting that would involve a committee that would use a formal standard setting process, and it would be public. And those would generate recommendations of the threshold cut scores that would go to the commissioner. The commissioner then would make recommendations to the board, and the board has final determinations about what cut scores you would like to adopt. When the board adopts the cut scores, then the department will apply those to the data that have already been gathered, and schools will be identified for CSI and TSI for starting this fall. So what we'd like to do is just quickly give a background about the standard setting workshop that took place, and we'll cover some things that were already decided going into the workshop, who the people were, the process, and then the results. So some of the givens are that at least 5% of Title I schools needed to be identified. And those were going to be identified by grade span, by elementary, middle, and high. So at least 5% of elementary, 5% of middle, and 5% of high. The indicators would consist of those measures that were approved by the board and were available from past data. The weight ranges were determined by the board. Those were included in the regulation. The proposal was to use a profile method because Senate Bill 1, Kentucky's law on accountability, does not allow an overall school that could be used to rank, overall score that could be used to rank schools. And then the other thing that was understood was that the standards that were set this year would be applied this year, but they would be reset next year when the 5-star system comes in place, because there will be new indicators that will be available then. So this was really a 1-year process. The indicators there were 3 for each of the grade spans. For elementary and middle, the 3 indicators were proficiency, separate academic indicator, and growth. I'll explain what each of those consist of in just a minute. In high school, they were a little different: proficiency, transition readiness, and graduation rate. So in elementary and middle school, proficiency is made up of student scores on reading and math tests. And it's essentially a weighted average about how students are doing. You're familiar with the performance levels on Kentucky's assessments: novice, apprentice, proficient, distinguished. And in reading and math, an index score was generated that's a weighted average of the student's performance based on the point scores that are, point values that are shown. In high school, the test was the ACT test. In the other, it was Kentucky's content-based tests. That was for high school. So in elementary, middle, elementary, middle, they're were all Kentucky tests. The separate academic indicator was a similar index score based on the student performance in the school on science, social studies, and writing. You may recall that in most schools there's only one grade that is assessed on each of those content areas because those are only administered once in elementary, middle, and high school. Growth is how an individual student's performance changed from one year to the next, and whether that was projected to have the student become proficient, if they were not yet proficient, if they were proficient to keep being proficient, or they could get credit if they were proficient, if they were moving up to become higher than proficient to be distinguished. In high school, proficiency was the same, except it was based on the ACT test. Transition readiness was a composite of academic readiness and career readiness. Students can show their academic readiness on a variety of measures, and on career readiness they could show their career readiness by meeting one or more of these the different indicators that are shown there: the industry certification, the CTE end of program exam, or an apprenticeship. It should be noted that the long-term plan includes dual credit. Dual credit was not included this year because the dual credit data were judged to be not sufficiently accurate and reliable. The graduation rate is the percentage of ninth grade students adjusted who graduate in 4 or 5 years, and so those are the three indicators and the measures that go into them. Any questions about what schools are being held accountable for?
Brian, just wanted to clarify. You said high school graduation is 4 or 5 years?
It's actually an average of 4. The four-year rate is calculated, and the 5-year rate is calculated, and then the average is taken. The 5-year rate is, as the board discussed before, was the 4-year rate is very important. It's students who are graduating in 4 years. The 5-year rate encourages schools, if a student hasn't completed in 4 years, to stick with them and help them complete in 5 years. In fact, the 5-year adjusted, the 5-year rate is about 1 percentage point higher than the 4%. It's not on statewide average. Of course, some districts it's larger than that, but it's slightly higher than the 4-year rate.
Okay, thank you.
As I mentioned, the weights were determined by the board, and these are the weights that were given in the regulation. They've been adjusted for the 3 indicators that were available this year. So the board actually set them on 5 indicators, but because some of those were not available this year, we did a mathematical calculation and just reapportioned the weight proportionally. So if the indicator weren't available this year, we just gave it weight according to the indicators that were available. Standard setting is something that is done in every state for assessment purposes. So when Kentucky set its novice, apprentice, proficient, distinguished levels, it used a standard setting process. So every state does that for assessment achievement levels. Kentucky is one of a few states that is using the standard setting process to set it for accountability standards. So what do states do if they don't do something like this? They have an in-house process where usually a Department of Education team will set the cuts and then announce to people, these are the cuts. The reason states are moving to a standard setting process for accountability is because it's more transparent, it's more representative, and so it relies on judgment not just from the Department of Education, but from a committee of people who have been selected for their expertise in saying this is what the values of the Commonwealth are. And then it also becomes a more public process. So you've received a report and the meeting was open to the public. Those things, I think, in my personal opinion, strengthen the process for setting standards. Of course, those become just recommendations. So the commissioner will make recommendations, and the board has freedom to do what you would like. But the process then that we're talking about is a very transparent process. The 15 people who were chosen are leaders from across the state representing geographic areas, backgrounds, different types of educational and other personal expertise, and a wide range of affiliations and background perspectives. We'll jump ahead. An evaluation was given, and Chris and I were present at the meeting and Hal and Gary were also present. They can give their views. I thought that every person was engaged, and their evaluations show that they were engaged and appreciated being part of the process. And so this was not a rubber stamp. These were people who were giving their opinions and participating. So now we'll cover the standard setting process itself.
Okay, great. Mr. Chairman, Commissioner, members of the board, pleasure to be with you this morning. I will just take you fairly briskly through the process. As my colleague mentioned, some of you were there and you're all too familiar with it. Others, this may be new or a bit of a refresher. But I'll start by amplifying something that Brian mentioned, which is simply that we think it's really important that the standard setting process is designed to be very transparent. We were transparent in the methods before we implemented it. The meeting was public, and of course all the information coming from it is available for scrutiny and available for comment. So this is not simply a statistical process, as we know. There's room for judgment, and judgment within the core principles that the Commonwealth has established for the accountability system, such as the relative weights of the indicators. So we designed the process so that we could bring together experts to understand the system, understand the principles, and operate in the light of day and make decisions about which schools should be identified for additional support. Also, as Brian mentioned, we followed a template for standard setting that we've seen in the field used primarily for assessments, for criterion referenced assessments, but we're seeing increasingly be implemented by states in their school accountability systems as well. That process is, this is how we spent August 22nd in about 6 or 7 bullets. That process involved a bit of an overview of the system. We provided some background on both the system and on the process that would be used, and even had some practice time before the committee began deliberating and making decisions that counted, so to speak. And we did this in rounds by school type. So we started with elementary school, and we asked the participants to look at the different performance thresholds. In just a moment, I'll talk about the data tool that we use to help support their decision making. Come up with some initial recommendations for which threshold seemed appropriate to set the boundaries for CSI, to do that independently. And then Brian and I showed the room the range of results. So we say, some of the cuts were as low as this and as high as this, and here were the range, and invited people to talk about where there was differences, why there might be differences, what may be the rationale for one participant to make a recommendation in one direction and another to choose a different recommendation. And then learning from conversations with their colleagues, we asked them to again make an independent rating, and those final ratings were presented, and the median was bookmarked as the committee's recommendation for the CSI cuts. So again, there was these 2 rounds. We did it by school type, and we did that 3 times during the course of the day. And then we had a conversation at the end of the day, which I'll talk about in just a moment. So one of the things when we were thinking about how to do this in a way that would really equip the participants to make thoughtful decisions, we realized that having good information about impact was really important. So it's very difficult, for example, to just ask somebody cold, well, what's a proficiency rate that ought to be appropriate for a threshold for CSI, or what's a growth score that should be appropriate. I think immediately people would wonder, well, tell me a little bit about how schools are doing. Is that, for a given proficiency rate, is that high? Is that low? Are many schools meeting that? Are many schools below that? So we put the data together in this tool that allowed people to see what the percentile of various cuts are. So somebody's saying, just show me schools, for example, in the bottom 20%, because that is an indicator of schools that are performing relatively weaker than other schools on this particular indicator. So by looking at this distribution by indicator and then being able to combine them across indicators, we felt helped equip the panelists to make good decisions about what were appropriate rigorous targets and what were targets that identified schools for support. We also wanted to show the weights of each indicator. As Brian mentioned, the board had previously established relative weights, and by looking at the percent of schools that would be identified for any one indicator threshold, we could get a proxy for that relative weight. And as the participants were making decisions, they could see how the relative weight moved in correspondence with their various cut recommendations. Might be easier to track that with just a screenshot of what the data tool looked like. Again, Mr. Heiner, Mr. Hougens will be quite familiar with this, having spent a good bit of the day studying these sheets for each of the school types. But over on the left there, you see we've got the percentile distribution from 1 to 99. Each of the indicators, you see what scores correspond with each of those percentiles. And then those highlighted cells were really the important piece. One could input a value into each of those highlighted cells, and the data below would indicate what number and percent of schools would fall below that threshold, if that was the recommended threshold. And then at the very bottom there, it shows across all three indicators what would be the final number and percent of schools that would be below that threshold. And because we knew that the federal law requires that be at least 5%. That became an important value, and we were very open about the fact that that's a value that the participants ought to focus on in particular in order to make sure the cut scores are reasonable and follow federal statute. So next we'll talk a little bit about the results. Let me just describe them generally, and then we'll present them specifically. And I understand you have our full report where everything we're saying is presented in more detail, and also you'll see a breakdown of the results in more detail than I'll be presenting here. As we frequently see when we do this kind of process, we saw a range of judgments on the first round, and that's to be expected. And again, that's why this isn't strictly a statistical process. We realize there's room for judgment. Somebody may say, I think growth is a little more important than proficiency. Somebody else may have a different view on that. And so we're going to see a range of those threshold scores. But as we moved into round two, we saw the scores coalesce a little more. We saw more agreement, and that was a feature. We hoped that as people listened and learned from their colleagues and considered different points of view, that there'd be an overarching shared view from the panel about what were appropriate criteria for these CSI thresholds. And we were pleased to see that variability settle down in round two, and we saw much higher agreement. We also paid very close attention to the evaluations that Brian mentioned. There were a number of things that we asked the participants to tell us about in the evaluation, but importantly, we asked participants if the standard setting process would help set appropriate expectations for identifying schools. Did the panelists agree with the recommendations? And 14 of the 15 participants did agree or strongly agree with that, which showed that the majority of our participants felt good about the recommendations that emerged from the process. Finally, there was some conversation during the process about what we're calling these jagged profiles, for lack of a better word. But the general issue is how much concern do we have about a school, for example, that might be particularly high on one indicator but exceptionally low on another indicator. So by being high on the one indicator, they would not be classified as CSI. Because they would be above the threshold for that one indicator, and all three, it's a conjunctive decision, all three are used when determining which schools are classified as CSI. So would there be any profiles, for example, that might give us pause because a school was, say, higher on growth but exceptionally low on proficiency? So we did take a look at that. The department did some additional analyses following the meeting to respond to the group's call that that's something that should be explored. And we found very few additional schools that would be identified if we set additional threshold cuts that obviated one indicator to look for exceptionally low performance on another indicator to the tune of 1 to 2 schools per grade level. And all of those schools would be identified as TSI. And then I believe this is the final slide that I'll present. These are the final recommendations. I don't think there's any need for me to read these off. You can see them and they're in the report, but I'll just orient you to the table here. You see for each school type, elementary, middle, and high, we show the 3 indicator categories, those being proficiency, the second academic indicator, and growth for each of elementary and middle school. And then proficiency, transition readiness, and graduation rate for high school. Again, those thresholds cut scores represent, let's call it the bar below which a school would be classified as CSI if they're below all 3 of those. So that's that conjunctive decision. Using these recommendations, so were the board to adopt this recommendation, you would see 33 elementary schools identified for CSI, that's 5.1%. 12 middle schools and 6 high schools, and you'll see all of the percentages are very near 5% and above 5%.
So I think let's pause at this point before we talk about the commissioner's recommendation to see what questions you have about the process and what we've talked about so far.
Okay, could you go back to the previous slide?
Sure.
So there's a star under, after recommended threshold cut scores saying that they're representative of the metric of each of the indicators. So proficiency is based on 100?
125.
125. So, so the cut score at 60, I mean, can you qualify what that actually means?
Sure.
Proficiency is a weighted average of students on the novice, apprentice, proficient, distinguished categorization. The point values are 0 for novice, 50 for apprentice, 100 for proficient, and 125 for distinguished. So if all the students were proficient, the score would be 100. If all the students were apprentice, the score would be 50. So the 60 is a little bit higher than all the students on average being apprentice.
Yeah, I did read that. And so this number of 60.5 was arrived at by going through that
Tool.
database where you could see the implications.
That's right.
And
Because
it was all agreed on that that was.
Right.
Okay, and then the same for the separate, so that's an even lower number.
Mm-hmm.
And then growth is based on
Reading and math.
the,
Growth is a measure of how much students grew from one year to the next. And the growth is whether they are changing from novice to apprentice, apprentice to proficient, and so on. That is based on a value table where if the student moved up a half level from low novice to high novice, or from high novice to low apprentice, that score, or if they stayed at proficient, if they were proficient and stayed, that score would be about 100.
And Brian reviewed a few months ago the givens. So the process has a lot of natural constraints. The board agreed to a certain weight, a relative weight for each of these indicators.
Weight range.
Weight range for each of the indicators. So that was a constraint. The fact that we needed to identify 5% of the schools, which is a number of schools, how many schools, that's a constraint. So you had a number of factors that constrained the decision-making. And so then the tool helped people to make the decision within those constraints.
That was a tough job, I must say.
It was a long day for folks.
Thank you for the explanation.
I'm just curious about your growth metric. So your normative is at proficiency at 100. So the growth, did you normalize that on the distinguished, or did you normalize it on the proficiency metric?
So students can get points, or schools can get points for students moving from proficient to distinguished. So there's not a cap on proficiency. So schools will get points if students move from a lower level to a higher level anywhere along the range of from novice all the way up to distinguished. Or the schools also get points for students who are proficient or distinguished, staying proficient or distinguished.
It's important to note, I think, that, you know, we're not saying that schools that don't make this cut are okay necessarily, right? It's just that we had to come up with a combination of these indicators that would identify the lowest 5% of schools in terms of overall performance, and that's where it comes out. There'll be schools that will be above this level of performance that still have some significant improvement problems. Many of those will be identified for TSI status as a way of sort of shining the spotlight on where their needs are as well.
Okay.
Rhonda, how many schools, based on current performance, would you expect would fall into the, numerically, how many schools would fall into
In
CSI or
CSI?
TSI? Yeah, the
Well,
bottom 5%.
in CSI, again, is a number based on the total number of schools.
Right.
So we have a lot of elementary schools. So when we say what's 5% of the total number of elementary schools, that's 33 schools. And they're Title I. Because remember, many of our elementaries are Title I. For high schools, you're looking at, and I can give you the exact number. When we're looking at Title I schools, at elementary, we have 653 schools.
So you're looking at 33
Is 5%.
33
of
schools,
653.
elementary, middle,
Yeah.
and high. I'm just curious how many total.
Middle school, it's 12. We have 241 Title I middle schools. At high school, we actually have just slightly over 100 high schools that are Title I.
Okay, so you're looking at a
So
total
it's
of about
5.
50 schools. How many schools are we
51.
currently providing site-level support to?
We are providing, right at this moment, Kelly will need to help me here, 24, is that right? 24.
So you're looking at more than double the
That's right.
workload.
That's right.
For staff. Are we staffed adequately for this? I mean, what do you feel about our capability here of adequately performing this?
I'll respond to that, Rich. It's going to require that we take a fresh look at how we provide support to schools. So we're not resourced to be able to provide the level of support that we've provided to these 24 schools to all 50 schools. And so Kelly is already working and taking a look at the model that we use and considering what it might look like to have a tiered approach depending on the needs of schools. And so supporting every CSI school probably won't look exactly the same.
So we're looking at changing our model of support, obviously, because we
Right.
don't have the capacity clearly to handle twice as many schools as we currently do with the current level of support.
That's right.
And to be clear, Rich, one of the reasons you're seeing the doubling of the number of schools that will be in, and regardless of what you set the 5% at, 5% is going to be about 50 schools. The reason is the criteria have changed based on the federal law for how we designate schools as CSI. Kelly and I were talking about this morning. The previous definition was bottom 5%, I think 3 consecutive years of missing annual measurable objectives, and at the high school level, a graduation rate below 80%, whereas the definition now is simply within the bottom 5%.
Regardless of how well they're doing.
By the criteria that the state
relative.
sets,
Yeah.
it
So
is
if
going to
everybody's
be the bottom
proficient,
5%.
you would still have 50 schools that.
I would love to have that problem.
Yeah.
But theoretically, yes.
I'm just curious about our workload and our ability to adequately provide the support that these schools are going to need.
It's a real concern and not something that we don't discuss every day. Absolutely.
So I gather that there was quite a bit of consensus on establishing these, but there was some indication of a difference of opinion, and I wondered if you could characterize where that was. What was the basis for disagreement?
So those who were at the meeting can also chime in. As Rhonda said, the task was fairly constrained, and so what the differences were, someone could say, I want the proficiency rate to be a little different, but if you make that higher, you have to make another one lower. And so the range of opinions were saying one is a little bit higher, one's a little bit lower, and so if we said 60.5, there weren't 15 people who agreed on 60.5, might be 60.4, 60.3, 60.6, 60.7, but the median was a good representation of that range. And then in the discussion at the end, after round 2, when people had their things, there was general agreement that that combination was a good one to go forward with. But I should mention there was. As Chris mentioned, a strong discussion about whether this method would be adequate for identifying all types of school performance. In particular, this one of a jagged performance, where the concern was if you have 3 indicators and you have to meet all 3, it's possible for a school to be higher on one and not be identified. And so that was that study that was done. How many schools would be identified if we checked for that jagged performance? And using the values that were investigated, it turned out that there were very few schools that had jagged performances like that.
And I'd like to add to that, we'll revisit this in a year, right? This gets us through the first year. There were really 2 areas that of concern that come to mind. One is this jagged performance that if you compared it to say you had a triathlon school, right? And the coach didn't train in swim, bike, and run, just trained in run. But when it came time to assess and the students got on their bike, they fell off, and when they went in the lake, they sunk to the bottom. But they did run well enough to be above that cut score. Some question of should it be if you pass one indicator, and one indicator that maybe is more interesting than others would be high school graduation rate. That today we have no minimum bar for graduation, and if you get past that 85.3% in graduation, that proficiency just doesn't matter. And transition readiness doesn't really matter in the determination of whether you receive CSI support, and which is kind of a foundational decision. I will say afterwards, Brian and Chris, I'm working with Rhonda, went back and looked at what if we just said 2 indicators. If you were really low on 2 indicators, in this triathlon example, in biking and swimming, you're really low there. Would that affect the outcome? And as they looked at it, it had relatively little effect. That if you were below that threshold on all 3, the performance tended not to be real jagged. You tend to be low in graduation, low in transition readiness, and low in proficiency. So it had minimal effect. I do think as we get a more robust input into the system, that merits that foundational discussion of being high in one area and very low in others, whether we should have kind of, I think you
Sure.
called it a first pass or a second pass or whatever, to look for jagged performance. The second item is this year dual credit in the transition readiness for high school. Dual credit is not included, which is really important, but the state systems were not set up to the point that they could, and Commissioner, you can talk more about this, but my understanding is state systems were not set up at a level that could be tracked this past year, but that will be tracked next year. And I think of one Eastern Kentucky district that I visited that's knocking the ball out of the park on dual credit, especially in technical areas and trying to get every student involved and doing really a state leader. And but those efforts will not be reflected in transition readiness this year because there wasn't a clear tracking method for this year. So I think you'll see some changes in that next year. So those two items, I hope, merit some discussion as we go into a more permanent system next year. But the federal requirement requires that we do something this year, and yeah.
The Standard Setting Committee did discuss what was in transition readiness and the fact that dual credit wasn't, and they took that dual credit wasn't into consideration in making their recommendation on the transition readiness.
With all of the schools that you're looking at and the indicators, things that wasn't added now, and you're going to look at it next year to weigh that and then bring everything in.
Right.
Is that
That's
correct?
right. That's correct.
Okay. So out of all of the schools in Kentucky, what we got, 6,000 and something?
No, it's about 1,900.
Title I, okay. And, okay.
One other point I think we need to make.
1,272.
1,200 schools.
One other point that needs to be on the record is no one knew the names of the schools, right?
Okay.
They're all identifier number. So to my knowledge, I don't know anyone that knows the name. Maybe somebody does, but in IT or whatever, but no one knows the names of the schools. It's a completely blind study.
With the blind study, so how long are we going to keep it blind?
So to this point, great question. So to the chairman's point, at this point, I haven't even seen the names of the schools. I'll be working with Rhonda and her team after the board has made a decision to take a look at what the impact looks like with specific schools and districts. But it was important to us throughout this process that even for me, in terms of making decisions and making recommendations, that I wouldn't even understand what the names of the schools and the districts would be. To Vice Chair Seaman's question, though, about timeline, we are incredibly appreciative of the board agreeing to have this meeting, because this meeting is really key to the timeline that we wanted to establish. The designation of schools for CSI and TSI as early in the academic year as possible is critical so that we can begin getting support to schools that need that support. And so the board approves cut scores, approves the weighting of those indicators today. Kelly will begin communicating with superintendents and districts individually about schools that are designated as CSI and TSI the week of September 17th. And then the week of September 24th, we'll be communicating to the state what those schools are that have been designated as CSI and TSI.
And Commissioner, I'll add that we have one more important step that we do in Kentucky, and we've been committed to that for many years. We will have a quality control day where districts will see those initial labels, and we have that scheduled, I believe, for the 12th of September. It's all done electronically. So that will begin to reveal to the district's data and designation. But it's the one final step of checking the data, not making individual student changes, but checking the data for any kind of programming kind of concern or problem. And then that will roll us into the schedule that the commissioner shared on the week of the 17th and the 24th.
If we could go one step past into the future on the schedule, is the next step for a school to prepare then a plan to respond to the designation and use of resources that would need state approval or department approval before implementation? Is that And we're getting pretty far into the school year already, and, but
It is, and that process is laid out in statute for the most part. There are some details that regulation adds a little bit more detail to, but districts are required to develop improvement plans at the CSI for CSI designated schools. Senate Bill 1, 2017 actually gives some different options to schools. Schools can continue to use the department for turnaround purposes, or schools now have the option to opt in and use a third-party entity for turnaround services. And so this will be the first year, the first time that plays out, and we'll be monitoring to see how that goes. We do believe, however, that for most districts that have schools designated as CSI, that they will probably continue to use the department.
so the department would prepare the plan, is that, or?
No, they would develop the plan. It would need to be approved. But for CSI designated schools, you're going to have department personnel that are playing a much more integral role on the ground level in the school.
And that plan approval is a 30, 90-day process, or?
Don't know. What is the timeline on that approval, Kelly?
So actually, once those schools are identified, they have 30 days to determine if they're going to use a department, another entity. Then they'll be required to go through a school-level district diagnostic review and a district-level diagnostic review. They will also be, those have to be scheduled within 45 days of the beginning of the timeline. After those diagnostic reviews are conducted, they'll use that information from those reviews to help pinpoint what are the areas that they need the most improvement in. The plan will be based off of the results from their academic data as well as those diagnostic reviews. They'll also be going through a process where they'll be applying for school improvement funds to support their plan. That'll be a competitive funding process. So a lot will happen once those schools are identified between now and the end of this current school year.
So as far as the funding being available to actually start additional resources available to these schools, it's not a January one?
No, it's not a January 1. So they would, we'll try to get it sooner than that, but typically you're identified in the fall, and then you go through the funding request, you go through the diagnostic review, you do the plan development, and you receive ER support. So typically, sometimes that doesn't happen until July 1 of the next school year when they would start implementing their plan.
But then by the next school year,
Yes,
we'll
they
have
would have-
different criteria for CSI and TSI.
Well, you really wouldn't have different criteria. It would still be bottom 5%, but you would have other pieces of your accountability system that would go into the whole 5 stars. But, you're still identifying the bottom 5%.
But with the schools that would be identified in the process today,
Mm-hmm.
would they stay in CSI, or if this time next year?
If they
we
meet
have-
the exit criteria, they would exit that CSI status.
Right.
But we're not going to take back their school improvement money or anything like that. They would still be working on their plan.
Okay, but this time next year, if we have different criteria for CSI and TSI, I'll call it refined criteria.
Okay.
Refined
a good
criteria
term.
for CSI and TSI with additional factors.
Yes.
Dual credit being one, some other things. And the bottom 5% are determined at that point.
We could have new schools.
If a school was identified today that
Mm-hmm.
isn't identified next fall, do they automatically exit? Or are they in until they?
They are in until they meet the exit criteria, which is established in Senate Bill 1, 2017, and the School Improvement Reg 280 that came, I guess it was finalized a couple months ago.
So refined criteria may add some additional schools to the ones today, but not
Yes.
necessarily
Not
automatically remove a school.
Exactly.
Okay, that's helpful.
So we already know it's going to be 50 schools, give or take a little bit, right?
51.
So doing the math, we already know 50 schools times how many people from the state need to be supporting them.
Well, that
What kind of budget do we need for that so that we can shorten all those windows?
Well, in terms of number of people, that's something we're working on. So to Hal's question earlier, it's not a given that the level of support that we've provided in terms of number of people in schools is going to remain constant. And Kelly is looking at some possibilities around tiered support depending on the needs of schools. So every school may not have the same number of KDE personnel that are there, depending on their specific needs.
And then the next question would be, knowing that there's going to be need for support, different levels, right? What kind of training or education or support do those people need to be prepared to really make a difference?
Yeah. Kelly, do you want to talk about your training for your team?
I think that last part of the question, you're talking about what type of training does the ER staff, the education recovery staff, need to make. So we're constantly training them up. And so we're all about building sustainable systems and closing the achievement gap. And so if you'll remember, I've talked before about our three-man team that we may have to reevaluate, but the education recovery leader is someone that has principal experience, superintendent experience, central office experience, who's coaching and mentoring that building level principal and his or her leadership team. And then the education recovery staff are teachers, and they're coaching and mentoring and modeling best practices for teachers. So they're actually, in the schools helping them build those systems of support for the school and for the students.
So my fear would be those roles seem to be fairly well defined, and that's good.
And those people are already staffed and are currently in schools. So typically what happens when new data comes out, some schools would be exiting, and so we may be moving staff that are currently working in school A, because that school is no longer going to be what used to be known as a priority school. So we will now adjust our staff and where they currently are placed across the state.
And how do we judge the effectiveness of those groups?
Of the education recovery staff?
Yes.
Based on the schools that they work in and if they've exited priority status or not. So we're starting a refresh. So, we've exited, I think, 18 priority schools since 2010. And so this year, we're doing the reset. Priority and focus go away. And so we're identifying our new CSI and TSI schools. So we'll evaluate the effectiveness of the ER staff based on how those schools do moving forward, if they meet the exit criteria.
So let me see if I understand this. 18 schools since 2010 have exited.
Yes.
Right, but we're going to add 50 new ones?
Yes. So what we're actually going to do when this goes public is we're going to go to zero. There'll be like a 5-second window where we won't have anybody. And then we will be identifying, based on those numbers, 51 CSI schools.
I have a question about the timeliness of the data. I know this has been a concern in the past. That's, I want to make sure I understand this. Assuming somebody tests into the bottom 5%, say in the 18-19 school year, we won't know that until the 19-20 school year is underway, and then CSI or TSI would actually begin then in the 2021 school year, when in fact they may have actually tested out of it, but we won't know that.
Well, that's not accurate, Rich. So
I hope so.
The data is based on the 18-19, so take this year. This year's designations will be based on the 17-18 school year. The decisions you're making now in the 18-19 school year are based on last year's data.
Okay.
But they would go into CSI and begin receiving support this year. So it would still be in the 2018-2019 school year that they would begin working on their plan.
But didn't you say that actually doesn't have a
They would-
plan until like a full year
The
later?
funding probably wouldn't happen until July 1 because they have to do the grant application. Those have to be
So
scored.
there's a lot of stuff to do before actual help is delivered.
Well, I would disagree with that.
In the sense of that,
But
where the rubber meets
people
the
will be
road.
there walking them through all of
Yeah.
that.
You've got somebody on the ground at
Yeah.
that point.
And the first step of help is, Kathy, is that diagnostic review. I mean, that I believe is a really critical part of the improvement process. Sending folks in, helping people to understand where their deficiencies are, where their areas for growth are, putting together a plan that helps to remedy those areas. That is the first really critical step of support, and that starts this year for new CSI schools.
So then what did the 17-18 tell you? I mean, in other words, when the first evaluation was done that determined that they were going to be candidates for CSI. Isn't there a lot of information there about what needs to happen? It just strikes me as a very long process to actually start, again, where the rubber meets the road, making the difference in that school system.
So I already have a date scheduled. I'd have to pull it up here, but it's like the first week in October. So I will be reaching out to these superintendents and principals, and then I'll be getting them in a room so they can thoroughly understand what it means to be CSI. We can talk about the diagnostic review process. We can get that scheduled. So, I mean, we will move just as quick as, I don't know who these schools are. So as soon as Rhonda and them finalize everything and give me those names, I mean, we start the movement.
So you'll have somebody on the ground almost immediately as they build out their plan?
Yes, because we want to help coach them, because
That's right.
we sometimes say they don't know what they just don't know. So we need to be there through all of that.
So you have some formative input while they're coming up with their
Yes.
summative plan?
Yes.
The question I have goes to the chair's question. I'm still a little confused by this. So you're starting to, you start at ground zero this time. You identify 51 schools. But since we're going to a refined criteria, again, specialist dual credit is going to be a big part of this conversation. And that's what I was whispering in the ear over here. So are you saying that we keep those 51 we have in the system? None could exit out, right? But you could have more added. So we could have more than 51 schools.
And that's why we have to look at our resources and talk about a tiered level of support.
Right, and obviously the commissioner and his staff, this is a management issue more than probably a board issue, but it seems to me that to me, could be the Achilles heel.
It is. I mean, even before we get there, I mean, 50 schools is a big jump from where we are now. I want to just comment on the criteria that you're talking about, though, and the differences that we've been talking about around dual credit. That pertains to high schools. Of the 50 schools, only 5 of them are high schools.
Okay, I'm glad you clarified that.
Most of the schools we're talking about are elementary and middle schools.
Let's, if we could, we've gone a little over an hour on this topic. Are there any other questions specifically about the standard setting committee and that process? If not, we can then move on into the next section of the commissioner's recommendation.
One quick comment, and that would be primarily to Kelly to say, the focus of the questions I think the board is asking is to make sure we're not setting the Department of Ed up for failure by not funding or supporting these efforts appropriately, right? I think the efforts are tremendous and there's a lot of great work going on. It's just now, as things are changing, how do we allocate the dollars the right way?
And I would say, Joe, I appreciate the questions and the concern. The thing for us to keep in mind is the number of schools we're talking about, in terms of the numbers, is not something that we have control over.
Right.
We get to make some decisions at the board level around how you determine what cut scores are and what the bottom 5% are. But once you set those,
Still 50.
it's still 50.
Right. And I wouldn't go so far as to say we've set the department up for failure, but the trick is, we faced an enormous challenge here, and there were many, many things about the state budget that the legislature approved this year that I appreciated. But one terrible oversight was eliminating that school improvement fund, and that in and of itself hamstrings this department in significant ways to provide the level of support that it has in the past. It just won't happen. These schools will not receive the level of support that they have in the past. And the department will have to be very strategic about how it designates its resources. And this is something that is beyond the department. It's something that needs to be addressed in the state budget in the future to make sure that if we're going to say that we value education and we want to turn around these low-performing schools, we've got to make sure there are resources in place to enable them to do that.
And are we going to be working on that with the legislature coming up?
It'll certainly be one of the things that we're advocating for. Absolutely.
Obviously, they're going to want to know what we're going to do with the money, not just give us more money, but.
Yeah, I would say, and with this conversation, that it's pretty clear.
Pretty clear.
And this discussion will continue, but let's move on to the next item. If there's nothing else specifically on the standard setting for the determination, cut scores, those type of technical items. If there's no other questions, let's move on to the
recommendation from the commissioner.
yeah, the recommendation from the commissioner.
Okay. And I think the commissioner, are you going to come and join us here? Yes, ma'am. Okay. Give you time to move.
Ladies and gentlemen, once again, we thank you for your willingness to have this conversation and make some decisions this early in the academic year, calling this special meeting, because as the conversation we've had clearly illustrates, the importance of us getting support to schools in a timely fashion is critical. We've identified these schools based on their performance last year. The sooner we're able to make designations and get into schools and start to begin to provide support, the better off for our schools and for our students. I want to begin the recommendation by saying that I place an extremely high value on stakeholder involvement, on feedback from the field. And so I have a tremendous amount of respect and appreciation for the group that came and spent a day with us to make recommendations to me and to the state board regarding what cut scores should be, how we should make these designations. We gave great consideration to the recommendations that came from the standard setting committee and believe those recommendations to be very solid. We played, as Chairman Heiner talked about in discussion earlier, we played with some alternatives that the committee was okay with us looking at some alternative ways of potentially designating schools, wanting to, more than anything, make sure that for CSI designation, we were not having schools that had an extremely low level of proficiency not be provided the level of support that they need with a CSI designation because of other factors where they might have scored higher. I do want to say that with the recommended cut scores, there are, in fact, some elementary and middle schools where proficiency rates are pretty low, but they do not qualify with the recommended cut scores for CSI designation. That is in large part because those elementary and middle schools with very low proficiency rates have very high rates of growth. And in the way the accountability system has been designed, the state board decided to give considerable weight to growth, particularly growth at the lower end where you're moving kids from the novice level to the apprentice level, from the apprentice level to the proficient level. And so even for those scores with low levels of proficiency, if you were showing that you are in fact moving kids forward at a pretty significant pace, the accountability system with the recommended scores works out to where those schools would not be designated as CSI. So with that, with one exception to the recommendation that came from the committee, I am recommending to you that we adopt the recommendations from the committee exactly the same as for elementary and for middle school, and with that one exception being to decrease the cut score for graduation, the graduation rate indicator at the high school level from 85.3 to 85. That one exception, that one change at the high school level was simply so that we only identify the bottom 5% of performing high schools. Leaving it at 85.3 would have given us an additional CSI school that goes slightly above the bottom 5%. So with that one exception, I'm recommending that we accept the committee's recommendation for cut scores. I do want to say one additional thing. We've had most of the conversation today has been about CSI, and it is because the decisions that you will make today, those cut scores will determine how we designate schools as CSI. But with that decision as well comes the designation of schools as CSI. Brian, Chris, and Rhonda explained what that TSI designation means. It's very simply, in layman's terms, it is having one or more student groups where the performance is at or below the level of the bottom 5% of schools in that level. For many of the schools that will likely be designated as TSI, that student group will be students with disabilities. For many of those schools, it will be African American students, Hispanic Latino students, English language learners, free and reduced price lunch. If you were to adopt the recommendations of the committee, my recommendations, or to be frank, any recommendations in the ballpark of where we are, you are likely to see the designation of between 45 and 50% of Kentucky schools as TSI, as qualifying for targeted support and improvement. That's a lot of schools. Wow. I want to be clear that that comes as a result of not a decision that you have made. It comes first and foremost because of a change in the federal law in how CSI and TSI are defined. That was part of the Every Student Succeeds Act. It was followed at the state level in Kentucky with Senate Bill 1 of 2017, which for the most part simply adopted the language from the Every Student Succeeds Act and put it into Kentucky state law. It's not a decision that the board made. It's how TSI is defined. And so the ballpark figure that I'm talking about, between 45 and 50%, is not terribly out of line with what we've seen with some other states across the country as well that are implementing new accountability systems and having to designate schools as TSI and CSI. I'm giving you that bit of context just so that you understand what is likely to happen. And finally, before I receive questions, I want to say, regardless of your decision, we'll likely have a very large number of schools designated as TSI. TSI does not mean that your school is a failing school. It's new criteria. It's a new way to look at schools, and it places as a priority the reduction and elimination of gaps between the performance of student groups. It puts gap elimination first and foremost for schools. And so schools that have done really pretty well over the last 5 to 10 years in Kentucky, made substantial progress, they may still be designated as TSI schools. Again, it doesn't make them failing schools, but it means that those schools will have to now begin to prioritize even more so the elimination of gaps between student groups. And that's a positive thing. I do think it's important that in our conversation, we not make TSI something that it's not, but at the same time, we hold it with a certain degree of importance to recognize that it is important. It's been recognized at the federal level, at the General Assembly level, and it has been recognized by you as a priority to raise the performance levels of all of our students, regardless of socioeconomic background, disability status, race, or ethnicity. It's work that we absolutely have to do. This new accountability system shines a light on those areas where previous systems have not done so. So that is my recommendation, Chairman Heiner. I'm happy to take questions from the board.
Okay. And this is an item that will take action by the board. I do appreciate, Commissioner, your comments about the TSI is a good thing, that it really focuses a bright light on achievement gaps between student groups within a school. So, and just to be clear, and make sure I don't misspeak here, but we're talking about a student group whose performance is at or below the level of the bottom 5% of schools for that student group. So the school could have a really high average proficiency, but a student group that's below the average level of performance of that bottom 5% of schools be designated as TSI. And just a couple of other points just to make sure we're clear here on the board. The 5% of schools as CSI is a minimum, right? So it could be a number higher than that, but that's the minimum. Giving our resource discussions, I can see why we're focused right at 5.00% or something like that. Okay, so it could be more than 5. Your recommendation is setting that, is setting it at 5. And lastly, want to make sure this is correct, that if you become a TSI school, that after 3 years, if you don't exit TSI status in 3 years, you automatically become a comprehensive support and improvement school. Is that correct?
That is accurate. So that there are 3 kind of categories of CSI schools that we'll have in Kentucky. The first category is CSI schools that you'll make a decision about today, schools performing in the bottom 5%. The second category is CSI schools that become CSI simply because they have a graduation rate that is below the bar that Kentucky has set, and I believe that's 80% in Kentucky. And then the third category is the category that the chairman is talking about. That's if you are a TSI school for 3 consecutive years, then you automatically become a CSI school.
And will the schools that have a TSI designation for a student group, will they also have to put over this almost, 8-month, 7-month timeline, put together a plan as well on how they're going for the department's approval on how they will exit their,
yes, sir.
how they will exit TSI?
TSI schools will have to develop improvement plans as well. Yes, sir.
So again, we're going to have, this spotlight, this good spotlight that TSI is going to provide. We're going to hope that all of those schools will take that spotlight and embrace that opportunity for improvement, put together a turnaround plan, and get out of TSI status. But invariably, there are going to be some that may not, and that's going to further add to the department's burden of providing supports and services to CSI schools.
Yes, sir. That is true.
Well, let's look at the scope of what we're looking at here. I mean, we're talking about 450 to 500 schools immediately going into TSI. 450 to 500 schools. If half those don't come out within 3 years, then those going into CSI, you can be looking at 300 potential schools where you're going to have on-site intervention. And that's more than we have employees in this division.
That's correct. It is, I cannot overstate for you, Rich, how concerning that possibility is for us.
Yeah, I mean, our objective here is not just to identify them, but to fix them, to improve them. I mean, that's the ultimate outcome that we've got to be striving for here, and we've got to have a plan here and resources in place to do that if we're going to be effective, as opposed to just identifying these schools that are coming up short. Another issue is that with our graduation rate requirements that we're going to be talking about later on, isn't that going to put additional pressure on that 85% number there on graduation rate if we tighten the requirements for high school diplomas?
You know, depending on the board's decision on high school graduation rates, it is very possible that you could see a dip in high school graduation. Now that rate right now in Kentucky is a little over 90%. So if the board were to approve a change in high school graduation requirements, it would take effect for freshmen entering fall 19.
That's correct.
So we would have some time to begin to prepare, to get those students prepared. even with an anticipated dip in high school graduation rate, it's hard for me to imagine the type of catastrophic change that would go from above 90% to below 85% in large scale.
Under current measures of performance, half of the people we give diplomas to are not proficient in reading and math now in Kentucky. And depending on what our tripwire is under the new diploma requirements, graduation requirements, you know, that's going to put some pressure on that, for sure.
Yeah, I do believe that with the conversation we're having, with the direction we've been moving, and with the time that we'll have before students actually have to meet that requirement, that for the most part, districts and educators, they're going to rise to the occasion, and more than anything, we're going to see increases in the performance and the achievement levels of students.
That's our objective.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Commissioner, first of all, representing higher ed, I appreciate hearing this, and also know that when you're focusing on closing gaps, that plan may look a little different than it looked in the past with their turnaround plans. So now my capacity question that everybody else is concerned I'm sharing with is that, yes, the amount of dollars it takes, the amount of folk it takes, but I'm going to say the kind of folk you're going to need to have here that will have the capacity and the knowledge to focus on this, because this is different. You know, when we're talking about closing gaps, it's more than just raising the overall level of scores in a particular school. So, yeah, we'll have to go and Chair Heiner put some pressure on the legislature to kind of give us some dollars to help you to do that.
Right, and Dr. Thompson, you're absolutely right. It is going to take us being really creative. So we talked about with CSI schools, with 50 schools designated as CSI, that we will not, given our resources, have the ability to have as many staff probably in every CSI designated school as we have provided for priority schools in the past. With TSI schools, we will not have the resources to put any person in a TSI school. And so it does require that we think very creatively about how we get resources, support to schools in mass, in very large numbers, how we support their efforts. And it requires that we think as well that most of that, in terms of resources, capacity building, to be honest, is not going to come from KDE staff members. I think we're going to have to find ways to leverage technology. We'll have to find ways to leverage partnerships, particularly with our co-ops and other education stakeholder groups across the Commonwealth, bringing in experts in particular areas, depending on what those disparities are in your district or in your school, because the strategies that you're going to use to address disparities between students with disabilities and their non-disabled peers can look considerably different than if your disparities are between African American students and white students. Yeah. So your point is very well taken, and we are at work already thinking about how we can be creative to meet the needs of students, but there is no way around the resource question. We are absolutely going to need resources if we're going to do more than, as Gary said, just shine a flashlight, but actually provide the resources and support to schools that they'll need to improve.
Mr. Commissioner.
Yes, sir.
One of the things we're talking about the 51 schools, and we're talking about financing, and we're saying that we don't have, you know, a certain amount of money. But I'm a firm believer that if we would look at those administrators of those schools, and you'd have to find out what they have, and maybe do some brainstorming or see where we could cut here, cut there, and we could do is, you know, possible what we could do here. But I think a lot of times we miss because we are willing to take all of the burden, and it's just so much burden we can take. And there are some school districts, you know, they don't have anything to offer, but then there's others that are able to maybe to foot the bill. And I think we have to look at all the schools individually and then see what can the board itself help with. Because like you're saying, we've got to go to the legislators to ask for more money. So I'm just throwing this on the table. Maybe we start to brainstorm and looking at these schools as quick as possible and see what they have to offer as well. Because, you know, we can't bear the whole burden by ourselves, and we don't know what's going to happen in January. But at the same time, children are failing, and we have to do everything possible that we possibly can to make sure that it, you know, doesn't go any further. And so that would be something that I would, you know, be willing to talk about is what are we going to do for these 51, you know, schools, and how are we going to do it?
I
Yes, sir.
appreciate Milton's
Absolutely.
point there, because I think it's real important to emphasize that primary responsibility for fixing these issues is at the local level.
Yes, sir.
Local communities have to take responsibility for turning their schools around, but we have a responsibility also to make sure that they have resources and support and guidance that they need if we are indeed going to give them this designation. So, yeah, I appreciate your point.
This is a major reset, I think, from coming down from what federal government under ESSA.
It is.
Reinforced by Senate Bill 1. Commissioner, I've heard you talk about this in the past, about sort of redefinition of what equity in education is. That equity, you could look at it two ways. Equity, one way is every student gets the same. To, I think, a better definition, every student gets what they need.
That's right.
And especially in the world that we live in today, I know we've seen that certainly in those of you connected to workforce efforts. You know, the education and skill levels required today in order to be able to support yourself and hopefully a family, you know, just keeps increasing. And that's why every single student group is important that raise education and skill levels. So what I hope, and I suspect we all do, is that it redefines equity to be that every student gets what they need. And so I'm pretty excited about it, you know, nervous about 400 of anything, you know, right, with the size of the department, but excited that may see some great progress on a lot of fronts for student groups that just haven't, you know, are still down in that bottom 5% in the state.
That surely is the opportunity, and as I said before, I am hopeful with what we're going to be able to accomplish in partnership with districts, in partnership with stakeholders across the state. Kentuckians tend to rise to the occasion even when the stakes are really high, and I don't think this is going to be any different.
Focus on intervention. Yes, Kathy?
So to Vice Chairman Seymour's comment about what resources are available, would it be possible to actually see financial data on the 51 schools that we're considering helping, and seeing how money is being spent and what efficiencies or lack thereof is apparent? Because to me, it's just very hard to know how a system is functioning without looking at the financial statements. So I know that you guys, or this group, is not finance people, but I just want to throw that question out there.
So not just for the 51 schools, but one of the things that we are working on for all schools as a result of the requirements of ESSA is providing a picture on the school report card of school level spending for all of our schools across the state. And so Robin and her team have been working on that. We're going to be able to provide that annual snapshot of what school level spending looks like, broken out by code, broken out by category of spending. So you'll certainly be able to see it for the 51 schools, but you'll be able to see it for all of our schools as well.
And is
That's
there
required by December, right?
Yes, ma'am.
December? That's awesome.
Yes, ma'am.
Great.
Any other questions for the panel before we entertain a motion? Any other questions? Okay. Do I have a motion to approve the Commissioner's recommended criteria for identification of comprehensive support and improvement for elementary, middle, and high schools. Okay, moved by Kathy. Do we have a second? Second by Laura. Any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Passes unanimously. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, next on our agenda is Interim Commissioner Lewis's recommendation to continue state management of Breathitt County Schools. I believe Associate Commissioner Kelly Foster will join us as well.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'll begin really briefly and then turn the presentation over to Kelly and be available for discussion and questions. We are recommending, as a result of the recent audit in Breathitt County, that Breathitt County continue to be designated a state-managed district. We believe Breathitt County has made really some notable gains in key areas over the years. And are actually beginning the process now of transitioning to the place where they are less dependent on management and direction from the state, and more so building that capacity at the local level. To that end, one of the steps that they have taken recently with the support of KDE and Kelly and her team has been hiring their own superintendent. That superintendent was issued a 2-year contract, and with the support of the department, we believe we can continue to support that superintendent, help to build capacity in his team, so that hopefully soon the district would be ready to transition away from state management and then leading its own efforts. So to be clear, I am recommending that the district remain designated a state-managed district, with the intention, however, that we would go back into the district within a year's time to conduct another audit, and as a result of that audit, reassess Breathitt County's situation and make a fresh recommendation as to whether the district should remain state-managed, go into state assistance, or have the Department of Education be removed from the management of the district altogether. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Foster to walk us through the specifics of the audit report.
So I agree 100% with everything that Dr. Lewis just said, and I think that the key thing with Breathitt County to recognize and know is that they have come a long way, a very long way, and I think a good analogy is they're on the tail end of management. You know, we are starting to see some capacity in their district, at the district level, at the building levels. Just last week, when their board voted to accept the findings of the audit and not to appeal the audit, you know, that wouldn't have happened 2 years ago. And they are very receptive of the help. And we worked with them on putting together a press release to put in both of their local newspapers. And what I found so interesting about that, you know, we had a quote from Dr. Lewis to talk about their progress and next steps, but we also had a quote from their board chair and their superintendent talking about our partnership, their partnership with KDE and that support. And so that is almost unheard of with that district. So that is a I'm very proud of the work that's going on there, and I think that when we come back to you in a year, we will see a district that, you know, even has more capacity that will be able to move forward with a little less support from KDE. So just to highlight, and of course we'll be back together in a month, and their superintendent and state manager will be here for that board meeting, and we'll be giving you all an overview of their new test scores and an update of everything that's going on. We had staff there yesterday taking this management audit. So the next step for a district that's in management is taking this audit and taking the findings and going through the PDSA process, Plan, Do, Study, Act, and determining based on those findings what do they need to do, what needs to be changed in their plan, who's going to be responsible for that, how that's going to be monitored. So that work started yesterday. And you all will see reflections of that in the PDSAs and the 30, 60, 90-day plans that are part of the October board packet that you receive on those districts. So just to kind of highlight some of the work that's happened there in the last year. I know you've heard Robin Kinney and myself talk about the increase in the nickel, but their taxes actually overall have been raised 11%, and that it's huge for that school district to have that extra income coming in. We, in the last year, removed a principal, and all of this is with KDE support, removed a principal for low performance in that school, removed 2 assistant principals who were also working in schools with low performance. We've hired a new curriculum director at central office this year that is really working well with the ER staff that I think are going to help align some things to see better results with instruction. We have hired a new chief financial officer, someone to focus solely on buildings and grounds and to use that nickel tax to help build that new ATC. They recognize that they need to have a newer facility there with state-of-the-art to help provide something for their students. And this year also, we have consolidated the middle school to the high school, so we will have more opportunities for our middle school students, plus we're saving money by not having students in a building that heating and air is bad, windows are bad. We've talked about the flooding in that building as well. And we're looking to make a transition also for the 1920 school year, moving one of the elementary buildings into another building to be more financially sound in those kind of facility decisions. So those are just some kind of the highlights in the last year, but you know, just feel like they really need our support. Philip Watts will be here, their superintendent, and he took that position full-time in the spring. He'd been there as a year as an interim. And, you know, Philip had never been a building principal. This was kind of his first leadership role. He worked there at central office with the technology department and is very respected by his peers, but really still needs that additional coaching and mentoring of that state manager there every day. So we're trying to build up his capacity so, you know, eventually he'll be able to stand on his own as superintendent there.
Dr. Foster, would you, so 6 years is a long time, right? And, but it sounds like there's a good, improved relationship. Would you characterize this year, maybe in a hoped-for way, but would you characterize this year as a transition year?
Yes, I think so, very much so. You know, I don't know how familiar all of you all are with the history there in the 6 years, but you know, it was the superintendent at the time when they were taken over ended up in federal prison. You know, the board, there was a lot of almost what you'd read in a magazine or see on TV of buying votes and creating positions for your family members when there wasn't funding there to support those positions. So I use that. I don't want to use you know, I use it not lightly, but I mean, it was a very corrupt district, and children were not on the forefront of that. So from where they were to where they are now, night and day. And yes, I think it's very much, we're in that transitional time period of where they can start to get their legs on their own. And you know, we want to, when we pull out, we want to know that they're ready and that they're not going to go backwards.
And the current superintendent has been there for how long now?
He was an interim last year. And at the end of last school year, we went ahead and worked with the local advisory board to issue him a 2-year contract. And the recommendation was to do a 2-year contract because we didn't want to do a 4-year contract and be getting ahead of ourselves. Do that 2-year contract, get back in the district within the 2 years under his contract, do hopefully a final management review. So when we come back to you, he'll be finishing his 2nd year, and we'll have a new management audit and hopefully more positives to bring to you. And as Dr. Lewis mentioned, a recommendation of moving towards state assistance or pulling out altogether.
So who would be responsible for renewing his contract?
So you guys are. Their board does not, under management, have authority, so they act as a school board, and they've received lots of trainings from KDE and KSBA because we're trying to build their capacity as well. So the commissioner actually signs that contract. The board goes through the interview process and the hiring process, but while they're in management, KDE has the final say-so.
Dr. Foster, I know they put a lot of the building blocks in place there. They've cleaned house in a lot of areas, and that needed to be done. How well are they doing at educating students?
Well, I have not seen the latest testing data, what you all just set the standards for. So I'm hoping when October, when we come back at that October board meeting, we will have some positives to share. They have had ER staff in their building. It will be 2 years in December. So of that six total years under management, they've only really been getting a support from the department around curriculum instruction and assessment. It'll be 2 years in December.
Right.
So we're hoping to see some additional gains with the release of this data.
Yeah,
but
because
I can definitely tell you there's much more of a focus at the building level and the central office level about students and instruction.
Right, right. I know the latest results available are not good. 34% proficiency. And, ultimately, that's what it comes down to. I mean, all of these building blocks we put in place are being put there to educate students, and that's got to be the ultimate measurement, I think.
Kathy?
So if the last 2 years were on curriculum and teaching and all of that, the first 4 years were around what issues that flagged you that they should be under CSI? And then also, do we have any sense at all as to how much it has cost KDE to provide this starting in 2012 through the present?
I can get you a total number for that from 2012 and to now. So they're not a CSI school.
Or what,
They're-
I'm sorry.
But what we did 2 years ago is we realized, hey, we have a state manager there and we're focusing on getting their finances. You know, one of the reasons they went into state management is they didn't have any money. And an example of that would be they might get a grant for something, and when that grant would run out, they didn't make any adjustments in their staff. And so then they would have to pick that up in their general fund. So over time, you know, they were broke. Their facilities aren't in great shape. And so what we realized 2 years ago is let's move some ER staff into this district and into those buildings. And because a state manager can't focus on, you know, educating the board, focusing on curriculum instruction and assessment, the finances, the transportation, you need more than one person. And so those folks have been added to help provide support to teachers in the classroom on a daily basis.
And how are the finances now?
Much better.
Got a nickel tax.
I don't have that. Their contingency is not, I mean, it's way above the 2%. But the one thing you have to keep in mind with Breathitt is because they do have so many older buildings, you know, a heating and cooling system could go out, and they would have to tap into their general fund for that. So, you know, that could be a big hit. So they are much more fiscally sound. And of course, we're still involved in any money that's spent there. We're approving that to making sure their dollars are being spent on the right things.
I was thinking they might have had, I thought I saw a report between 1 and 2 million. Does that sound?
That sounds right.
Right range?
I didn't want to speak out of
in the
turn.
bank? Elisa?
Given the discussion that we've just had about bringing on 51 new schools, does this still make sense to keep them in, you know, being state managed?
Sure. So, and that's something that I've talked about with both of my state managers in Menifee and Breathitt. They're very well aware that some of the resources that they have may be pulled out to go to other schools once the new data is released.
I can say as well, Elisa, you know, our goal, I've said this a few times over the last couple of months, we have no desire as a department to manage to manage school districts from the state level. That's not what we want to do. The concern about a district like Breathitt, and to be frank, a district like Menifee that is currently still in state management, is that you don't want to pull out before the district has capacity to stand on its own 2 feet, Because if you do, we will have to be back there immediately anyway and probably have to expend greater resources than it would have taken just to get them to the place of sustainability. But I think it's an important question, one that we should continue to ask.
And so it's roughly, I think I read 1.5 million estimated cost to Katy per managed district. Is that correct?
So we pay the salary for the state manager, and then the ER staff that's there, their salaries, that's how we come up with that number. But like I said, when new schools are identified, some of those ER staff members may be leaving our state managed districts. The only reason we were able to do that is because we had exited priority schools.
Right.
In the last 2 years, we haven't identified new schools. So we had some staff that we could put in the state managed districts.
Got it.
So, Dr. Foster, we might have how many people there this week, would you estimate?
We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We have 7 people working in that district right now.
Okay, thank you. Other questions for the panel? Just wanted to clarify the audit, Dr. Lewis, that you talked about in a year. Is that something that would be actionable by our fall meeting next year? In other words, audit prepared, recommendation ready by October of next year?
I would probably say December.
By December.
If because we want to let them start school. We don't want to be there the first 2 weeks of school. So if we can get in there early September, we can probably get that. We can definitely get it to you by the December board meeting at the latest.
Because that would give us time to actually conduct the audit, and then me get a recommendation to you all and give the board enough time, the local board, enough time to make decisions on whether or not they want to ask for a hearing. I can definitely see by December.
Any other discussion with the panel? If not, I'd entertain a motion to approve or disapprove the Commissioner's recommendation that Breathitt County Schools continue to be designated a state-managed district in accordance with KRS 158.785.
So move.
So moved. We have a second?
I'll second.
Okay, from Gary. Just wanted to make sure our reference there is correct. Is that correct?
A motion to approve.
Yeah, motion to approve. Thank you. And 158.785, do we need a subparagraph there? Are we okay? You think we're fine? Okay. All right, any discussion? We have a motion and a second for approval of the recommendation to remain a state-managed district. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Okay, recommendation passes unanimously.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we've been going for 2 hours. Let's take a break here and try to hold it to 10 minutes, and then we'll come back.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, you all right? That's what I'm talking about.
The will of God.
All right, we're back in session. The next topic is high school graduation requirements, and as board members, you probably recall at our last regular meeting, we had a really good overview on the changes, proposed changes in high school graduation requirements. I've, just as a little bit of refresher, we had such a good conversation, and it went on for a while, that asked that our panel be reassembled to continue that discussion. This will be back on the agenda for the October meeting, likely, for hopefully final consideration of the recommendation at that time. Just by way of refreshing, I've asked Dr. Lewis, or someone on our panel, to just talk about, refresh us the differences between sort of the current high school requirements and a sort of a top-level way, just quickly, the difference between the old and the new. Certainly two outstanding items from our conversation last time. One was on career exploration. There was discussion about should there be a course in career exploration? How do we address the fact that many students, are not exposed to the wide breadth of opportunities for them from a career academic, career and technical, a whole host of things that they may not see in their neighborhood. And how do we best make sure they know the types of things that might spark their interest in school? And then one other item was on as you might remember, there is no minimum bar for graduation today, for high school graduation, but the idea of bringing in a minimum bar of basic reading and math, some basic reading and math proficiency. But if a student meets that early, let's say in middle school, meets that minimum, should we still have to meet that minimum at some point in high school in order to be eligible for high school graduation? So I think overview, career exploration, and students that meet that proficiency early, should they be given any consideration for having met that early in their education? And with that, I think Commissioner Lewis.
Yes, sir.
Interim Commissioner Lewis.
Yes, sir. So thank you all for inviting us back to have this conversation. I'll start by way of introduction and address the areas that Chairman Heiner asked us to address in introduction. But even before that, I want to say one of the things that strikes me in the conversation that we've had, two things that have struck me in the conversation we've had across the state around what we're proposing with high school graduation requirements. One is that in mass, in large part, people have been very supportive and have noted that there is a need for us to have some minimum threshold, some very minimum requirements so that we can assure that regardless of where a student earns a Kentucky high school diploma, we can be assured that a student has made basic minimum skills in reading, in mathematics, and that student is well prepared to be successful in the next step in life, whether that be going into post-secondary education, which we hope they do, going directly into the workforce, or whatever that next phase of their life is going to be. One thing that I've heard from a minority of folks, a small minority, but I think it is worthy of giving at least a little bit of consideration here, is the idea that our proposal in some way lowers standards for high school graduation. And that couldn't be further from the truth. The reality is today we grant high school diplomas to kids, and I'm not exaggerating here, who struggle to read and do basic mathematics. Under the proposal that we're laying out, that could no longer happen. Students would be required to demonstrate minimum levels in reading and in mathematics as well. Under this proposal, students would be required to demonstrate transition readiness. This is a much higher bar than anything we've ever required of high school graduates in Kentucky before, demonstrating that they're academically ready to go on to post-secondary education and or ready to go into the workforce by demonstrating career readiness in one of a few different areas that we've outlined for you. So that I'll give that as way of introduction to the conversation, and then I'll highlight some of the key differences between what we're proposing and what is in Kentucky's current high school graduation requirements. Overarching the changes is the idea that we wanted to ensure that all students met certain basic level criteria while at the same time providing greater flexibility for schools and districts and students to be able to craft plans of study that align to where students want to go to next. So assuring basic levels of competency while at the same time providing greater flexibility in recognition of the fact that kids are going on to do different things after they finish high school. But whether a student is going on to be an electrician, a plumber, a machinist, a dentist, a medical doctor, or an attorney, they deserve to have a rigorous course of study that prepares them well to do whatever's coming next. We believe this proposal accomplishes that. So a few key features. The proposal continues to require 22 credits of coursework for students to earn at the high school level. In English, it would continue to require in total 4 credits. The difference would be, whereas currently we specify that students must complete English 1, 2, 3, and 4, under the proposal, students would be required to complete English 1 and 2. The additional 2 English credits they would have greater flexibility in determining, which would open the possibility of students taking dual credit English coursework. That would not be English 3 and 4, but courses that need to still be aligned with the Kentucky academic standards. Second, in mathematics, currently the regulation's a little bit tricky. It actually requires 3 math courses to algebra 1 credits without requiring 4 math credits. We want to clarify that by requiring 4 math credits, but specifying that students would only be required in geometry. At the district, to some extent at the student level, decisions would be made about the best mathematics courses to follow that Algebra 1 and geometry course. Again, just like English and all the rest of the core content areas, the courses students take must be aligned to the Kentucky academic standards. So even though we're talking about providing greater flexibility in the specific courses students would take, courses have to align and cover the content in the Kentucky academic standards. In science, we currently require 3 credits. We would continue to require 3 credits. In social studies, we currently require 3 credits. We would continue to require 3 credits. Work-based learning experiences and career pathways. Currently, the regulation around high school graduation in Kentucky permits, I believe, 8 credits. 7 credits. That should be aligned to either academic preparation, career preparation. What we're proposing in this regulation is that the courses students choose to use in that space be more structured, that they be more aligned to getting a student prepared for transition readiness, because a requirement for high school graduation would be that students are transition ready, either academic ready or career ready. And to achieve career readiness, the courses that students are going to need to take aren't going to be able to just be one course from here, one course from there. They're going to need to be courses that find themselves aligned in particular areas that prepare students either to earn an industry recognized certification, to complete an end-of-program assessment that's aligned with articulated credit, completing approved apprenticeship programs, work-based learning experiences. Students can't accomplish those things by just pulling electives from here and there. There's going to have to be a much more intentional effort, even to the point where we're saying that that coursework needs to be aligned with the student's individual learning plan. We want ILPs to be something that districts, schools, and students and parents are using much more intentionally to plan coursework and experiences for students as they're preparing what comes next, rather than just the compliance tool that they've been in the past. In terms of assessment, and this is the last piece in my overview, we're proposing moving away from end-of-course assessments that we currently use. Currently, we give end-of-course assessments in Algebra 2, in English 2, in biology, and in U.S. history. With the flexibility that we're proposing providing in terms of the courses that students are able to take, we're proposing moving from end-of-course assessments to end-of-span assessments. So at the end of 10th grade, students would take, for the first time, a reading and a mathematics assessment. Meeting a certain benchmark score on those assessments, the reading and mathematics assessment, would become a high school graduation requirement under our proposal. That would mean the days of students earning Kentucky high school diplomas without being able to read and do basic mathematics would be no more. That's an important step. That's a level of accountability at the student, at the school, at the family level that we've never had in Kentucky before. The second assessment piece is we would assess science and social studies at the 11th grade level, but again, they would be end-of-span assessments. So they would test the Kentucky academic standards without contesting content in a particular academic course. Whereas now we specifically have a U.S. history course, it would be a social studies course that covers the content and the standards without being a U.S. history specific course. Those are the key differences between what we're proposing and what the current high school graduation requirements are. I'm going to turn it over to Amanda next to talk through the two key areas, Chairman Heiner, that you raised. One around the question of assessment, and then the second around career exploration. We had discussion at the end of the last conversation on high school graduation requirements about the possibility of a career exploration course at the high school level that might be a requirement. I also raised for your consideration the possibility of treating this more like we treat financial literacy now in high school, where you would have the expectation that students have been exposed to certain content either through coursework or through a program. That, I believe, would provide greater flexibility. But Amanda will lead us through that conversation.
Commissioner, if you would just address one, you mentioned dual credit.
Yes, sir.
So we have the foundational and then the performance area, and just what slightly over half of the credits are in performance, I think 12 credits. Would it be safe to say that a student that really wants to move fast on the academic track, that those 12 credits, 36 college credit hours, could end up being all dual credit if they were, in a system that provided that? Or would there be some of those that really wouldn't fit within dual credit?
It is possible.
It's possible.
Yeah,
Those could all be, because of the flexibility there, that half of
it is possible. I would say as well, though, not just at the performance level. There's the possibility of coursework at the foundation level that could be dual credit coursework as well.
So I know we have a few schools in the state that are kind of focusing on an associate's degree or close to an associate's degree by high school graduation. So this would enhance their ability to accomplish that. Is that
Right.
a fair statement?
Right. So even from some of the board members, I believe, Elisa, you've talked about this as once with your own son, and Amanda, you've talked about this with your son as well. Students sometimes taking dual credit coursework at the high school level, because our high school graduation requirements around specific courses are so rigid. You could have a student taking an English dual credit course or mathematics dual credit course, and then either have to apply for a waiver for one of the course requirements in English or math at the high school level, or just take additional math and English courses, because the dual credit course is not the specific English or math course that has been required. Under this proposal, with the greater flexibility in English, math, and it already exists in science and social studies, you wouldn't have that waiver that waiver process wouldn't be needed. Students would have that flexibility built in. Now, it is important to note, and I didn't say this previously, what we are proposing, as I know you all know, but I want to say for the public and for our audience, are minimum high school graduation requirements at the state level. School districts can, and some school districts often do, take the minimum requirements set at the state level and then impose additional requirements. So while we're proposing granting greater flexibility in coursework at the state level, for example, in mathematics, say Algebra 1 and geometry, and then saying students have flexibility to take those additional 2 courses, a district could come on top of that and say, no, we want to require that students continue to take Algebra 2.
Or calculus or whatever they,
Absolutely.
Yes, sir.
whatever they wanted to do.
So, a quick question about the end of span tests. Who's going to be creating those?
So,
You want me to do that, or you want?
yeah, I'll start with the law, and then ask Rhonda to fill in some of the details there. Kentucky's Senate Bill 1, 2017 requires that all of our tests are developed by Kentucky teachers, and that they test only Kentucky academic standards. So that applies to high school examinations, applies to examinations we provide in grades 3 through 8 as well. Now, that doesn't mean we wouldn't work with a vendor, but those conditions have to be met. Now, Rhonda, you want to talk about that process?
I was just going to, basically, we will bring together Kentucky teachers, and they will develop the items. Now, there will be a vendor to support that work and to put the assessment online, KDE staff here to support, making sure that we're measuring the standards. We'll have to develop a blueprint for what percentage of the test comes from what type of breakout of the standards. But a number of the assessments we have used in Kentucky, such as the K-Prep 3 through 8, have had a similar process. But what Senate Bill 1 really pushes at is the development needs to be teacher-based, educator-based. And so that work would move forward in that manner.
And that process also is outlined pretty specifically in Senate Bill 1, so it's very similar to the standards rollout of the different teams of teachers for review and development. And so it would be a similar process with the blueprint piece, especially about what would be assessed. Okay. Go ahead. So, good morning. Or I think it's still morning. So the conversation around the career exploration, I'm really going to tap into David. As soon as we met last time, we met last time in August, David and his colleague Kylie started to dig into the data about the number of students who are already engaged in career exploration courses at the middle school and high school, because that was part of the conversation is, do you require it that beginning of high school, or is that too late? Because really they should be building out their ILP, their individual learning plan, really starting in 6th grade to start talking about futures. And so one of the things I want to bring to your attention, I'll definitely turn it over to David to share some of the things that are going on in the state and give you an idea of where we are. But one of the requirements in Senate Bill 1 and in our new accountability system is that we do have to do a profile, a school profile, that we produce publicly, that districts will have information shared about their programs for career exploration, specifically in the middle school. These were a replacement from our program reviews that we used to have over visual and performing arts and the world languages. Now it's a school profile that districts have to report on, and we will pull that data on courses that students are involved in. That data around schools that offer career exploration in middle school will be publicly reported on what's even offered to students. And from David's data, it looks like there's some growth to it that really is needed, because we need to kind of revamp what that looks like. And David, do you want to share some of the numbers and ideas?
Yes, I'm going to give you, I'll start with just the raw data related to courses. And in middle school, basically 178 of our 438 traditional middle schools offer specific or exploratory courses. And when I say specific, it might be something to a cluster, not just a specific, which when you look at that on a percentage basis is about 41%. And when we start looking at the high school data, percentage of students not enrolled in a course is 94%. So, but I want to point out too, from our perspective in career and technical education, we want exploring done before high school, because with these strengthened pathways, with the dual credit success that you're talking about, Mr. Chair, we need to start that freshman, sophomore years in those pathways. But I would like to point out that what has happened with, and I was just talking to Amanda before we came to the table, back in the early 90s, we had a great deal of thrust in putting technical programs in middle schools. And I think we had a really difficult time servicing those with teachers as we are, and those programs just have gone away. But to say that we're not giving career exploration to anybody is not really true either, because this is just the data around those courses. So I'd like to share with you some of the things that are done, and I'm going to emphasize a lot by talking about what centers are doing, but also realize that elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools are doing a lot of these things too. And I think as the profile is going to encourage a lot more schools to address these types of experiences that might be even more valuable to the students than receiving an exploratory course in high school. So one of the things that that's being done in schools, and Dr. Lewis was with me in a technology center that took a specific period of the day and was running either the whole 7th and 8th grade class through this program. They might take 3 to 6 weeks, depending on how many programs were in that center, and those students would reside in that class and explore what that career looked like, what the work looked like, and what you needed to be successful in it. So that's one that's really strong and has done a great job in schools that have used that. And then there's another one where before registration occurs, the students will be rotated through the school on tours and that kind of thing. And that can happen from 8th grade all the way up through 10th grade, depending on who's serviced at the centers. There are career camps that go on in the summertime where middle schoolers come in and they engaged in making everything from bottle rockets to mini robots to maybe doing a little welding project. So there are others that have participated in the Century 21 program. It's an after-school program where kids can explore what they want to do. Some can have partnered, and that's a big area of growth that could happen, where that could be engaging those students in that career exploration. I know a lot of career and technical education programs send student ambassadors out. For example, a health science class might send their HOSA president and 2 or 3 students out to an elementary school and teach them dental hygiene, and then talk about first aid and those kind of things and their careers that they're in. And all of those other programs do similar things. Electrical students might talk about home safety and a little bit about the career and what they're doing, demonstrating projects. The career and technical education student organizations, one of the programs they had was Unite to Read. An evening they brought in middle school kids with a theme that was tied into a book, and they rotated through those programs and got engaged with what was going on at the school there. Sending students to career days. There's a lot of schools that have career days. You'll see the parking lot filled with local businesses where the middle and elementary students get involved there. Students used as guest speakers. And obviously, we just talked about 6th through 9th grade students taking exploratory courses and having your own career fair within your building. and bringing those outside guest speakers in. So there's a whole lot of things out there that a lot of schools are doing. And I think with the emphasis on exploration tied to the profile, I think you can see great gains in that.
And I think one of the things that are the key pivotal points, which we talked about before, was the importance of that human interaction with advising, true advising. I was downstairs on the first floor meeting with the Gifted Advisory Council, and a lot of our conversation around graduation requirements was about the importance of advising, the staff advising students, not just a counselor, but they're really going to have to be there are new efforts around what does that really look like, and we've been working on that diligently for the past several weeks. And so, you know, definitely programs, as Dr. Lewis mentioned, gives much more flexibility. But the course, I would just be cautious because I don't know that that gets the advising piece of really getting into maybe the career interest and opportunities that are out there. And there are a lot of good work to be done, but I think it's going to be very telling also when the school profile comes out to see what is offered and what is not, because that's almost what Gary had said about shining a light on something, and then what do we offer as solutions and ways to really remedy that, because this is really about serving the student, the individual student around this with expectations of demonstration of skills and knowledge when they graduate, that they're equipped with what they need to move into their next steps in post-secondary. So that's kind of where we wanted to start the conversation around that. Did you want to add anything else to that, Dr. Lewis?
So I believe some of the most promising programs that I've seen are happening at the middle school level, just to echo what David is saying. That, you know, the visit to Marion County and the idea that all of their 8th graders were running through this career exploration program that was a course at Marion County ATC, I think is really promising. I think there's a lot we can do as a department to highlight those types of practices, to strongly encourage that districts are providing those types of experiences at the middle school level. My concern around the course is that it would likely create a new requirement, to be frank, that schools could jump through, could meet. It would be seen, I think, largely as another hurdle, but in many cases would probably fall short of having the type of impact that we would intend for it. That would be my concern about creating it as a course. And so if we were going to incorporate the expectation that career exploration be a part of the high school experience, my recommendation would be to do so with greater flexibility, similar to the way we've that the General Assembly passed legislation around financial literacy, where students would be required to be exposed to that content, participate in a program, or have a course, depending on what they wanted to do at the district and at the school level.
Want to just start off discussion. Earlier on high school graduation requirements, we talked about students taking elective courses in a pathway. But students a lot of times change direction in life. I know I talked to, as I talk to 3rd graders, I do believe 3 out of 4 want to be a veterinarian. I mean, I don't know what it is about being a veterinarian, but 3 out of 4 want to take care of dogs and cats. And, but, that changes. Now, some stay with it, right? But, at some point, it may be middle school, it may be 10th or 11th, it may be somewhere in there that decide all of a sudden information technology, well, that's really interesting, or law, that's really interesting. So would we be able to, will we have built in, and I know they do this in Europe, they have really defined pathways how to kind of change your mind and go in a different direction. And so, I bring that up for 2 reasons. One is that the career counseling effort, while being very important in middle school, there's still a lot of decision going on as children change rapidly in those high school years, and the importance of some additional career counseling. And then second, will our high school graduation requirements allow that kind of flexibility for the student that sees a 3D printer and said, that's the coolest thing I've ever seen. I just want to learn more about it.
So I'll tell you, a student comes to mind for me as you asked that question. Student I met a couple weeks ago in Maysville at the STEAM Academy there. And they brought in some kids and they were talking about their career pathways. And this one particular student, she was there representing the culinary arts pathway. And she's telling us about her coursework and the types of projects she was working on, what that pathway entailed. And then I asked her, said, so what are you going to do? And she said, I'm going to be an engineering major. And I was like, wow, okay, so how did that happen? Well, she's completing a culinary arts pathway. She's also completing a pre-engineering pathway. And there's enough space in the credit hour requirements that are built in, 7, 8 credit hours, that students can complete more than one pathway. I mean, really, if a student is going the career route, my recommendation would be that they're not just earning one industry-recognized credential, but that they're earning multiple. There's time even within the 22 credit hours that are required. So it really does not constrain students. There's enough flexibility to allow for exploration, not just to try different pathways, but even to complete multiple pathways.
And then the second part of that, if we heard Mr. Horstman, that about 40% roughly of our middle schoolers are in some kind of intentional career exploration, and about 6% of our high schoolers are in some kind of intentional. How do we go from 40 or 6 to 100 if it's not through a course, which I think I heard was the recommendation? That's a pretty big change of focus, or an additional focus for schools. How do we encourage that?
I think it's the ILP, to be honest with you. So think about this, and this is really important to thinking about what we require at the state level, and then how that's interpreted and acted on at the school level. It has been a requirement by statute that all kids beginning in middle school complete an ILP, individualized learning plan, where students are supposed to be thinking about careers and career pathways and their futures and aligning their coursework and their experiences in high school to complete those. We have a really high rate of compliance, or we had a really high rate of compliance in terms of schools ensuring that kids checked off the box for the ILP. But if you were to ask kids, teachers, parents, some of you who've had kids who've gone through high school in Kentucky, how meaningful has that experience been for your kids? I see some of you laughing, because the reality is, for very few kids, it has been meaningful. Where we're moving to with the ILP is that it becomes much less a compliance tool, something that districts and kids and counselors can check off the box and say that we did, but insisting that it be aligned with the actual courses that kids are taking, that their pathways align with those things. And so to achieve that, this is our theory of action, it actually requires that we step back as the state, because we were providing a platform with career cruising, where students could, guided by their schools, completed the minimum requirement, which didn't get them very far, but they completed the minimum requirement, did not actually result in really solid advising or career planning. But we've moved back. We're no longer providing career cruising. But what we're saying to districts is that the ILP process, designed at the district level, designed at the school level, has to accomplish these things. And already I'm pretty encouraged by some of the things that I'm hearing from districts, because when you take back the kind of bureaucratic hurdle, bureaucratic requirement that we give to districts and say, this is what we want you to achieve, you have the flexibility now to design processes to ensure that your kids are being advised and aligning their coursework with it. You see all types of creativity.
And I can tell you, we hosted a webcast last week. They had about 200 views so far, and this is the second one we've done on the ILP in just about 3 months' time, because that is the #1 request. And so our new coordinator for school counseling, Dr. Damian Sweeney, has been on for a couple weeks. He came from being a high school counselor who worked on career pathways. That was his role, to advise. And he has been to several of the co-ops. We've gotten to see what they're doing doing to help support their districts, it's phenomenal. It's so much more authentic. It's helping them to build out resumes of their activities and ways that they want to go, whether it be directly into a career or a technical school or a post-secondary institution. It's much more authentic than just clicking buttons, and that's encouraging. They want models. They want to see what it could look like, and so really this is a building year for people to say, okay, we really haven't been doing this. The conversation we even had downstairs that the gifted advisory were just talking about is how important it is that the advising really be centered around students and that we use all staff. What does that look like? You know, teachers are with their kids every day. The counselors are not. You know, there may be 400 or 500 kids assigned to one counselor. So the conversation is the right kind of conversation because it's back on the student, not the compliance piece. And so, you know, that's encouraging. It is the #1 question. And even though we've done the webcast and provided resources, we're still getting requests to come back and share more information, other ideas, and just kind of give the thumbs up if they're moving in the right direction because they're actually reading what the requirements are around the IOP and the intention of it, the communication of it, and what you do with it. To me, that's the first time we've had real conversation about individual learning plans in a long time. In all honesty, from all aspects, as a administrator, a parent, and now in being here. And so that's the direction, and it's hard work. It's not easy, especially if somebody wants to do something that there's not a lot of job opportunities in Kentucky. And how do you have that conversation? You know, we have contacted Dr. Akers from KY Stats, and she's already connected with Dr. Sweeney about what tools that KY Stats has, just what you all saw at your retreat, and how that can be incorporated with the counselors. And he's really excited about the opportunities to show our counselors and our staffs how to use that data to have real conversations with students. If you want to be in the western part of the state, these are the high demand sectors, but if you want to do this, this is really going to call you to be in different parts of the state or outside. Those are real conversations that one platform cannot have. It really can't. And so we're really excited. Actually, I told Dr. Akers that we want her to come back and co-present with us to really show how we're using those tools, not just as an FYI for you all, but really embedding that into the schools, which I think was a conversation you all had at your retreat. Like, how do we use these tools with the people who are working with students every day? So that's what we're working towards because we see it. It's a gap that we're really working on, but I think that's the key piece of it.
Some communities I know have jumped out front, Bowling Green, Warren County with their SCK launch. I mean, put together business community schools working together. It's having a big impact on children. Exposing them. Rich?
We're essentially backing away from micromanaging the process and moving toward defining the outcome.
That's right.
But allowing school districts the flexibility to define their own process as long as they reach the defined outcome.
That's right.
That's right.
Of course, you all are familiar with the one big criticism we've had, that we're lowering the bar by eliminating the Algebra 2 requirement. Would one of you speak to that? Are we lowering the bar by not requiring Algebra 2 anymore?
Sure, we currently require Algebra 2, but we graduate kids who can't subtract. So we will no longer, under proposed high school graduation requirements, graduate kids who cannot do basic mathematics. We will no longer go through the motions, do a dog and pony show and say, yeah, we require all of our kids to take Algebra 2, but then send them to college and they have to take remedial coursework before they can enter credit-bearing mathematics courses. Reality does not align with what we've said or what we've had on paper. We are in no way lowering the bar. We are going to ensure that when a kid receives a Kentucky high school diploma, they can read, they can do basic mathematics, and that they're prepared for success and in the workforce. That is something that we have never done in this state before.
Well, then how can students be required to complete Algebra 2 successfully and graduate not being able to do basic math? How does that happen? How does that happen?
I think that's a great question, Rich.
Well, it's the end of
Does anybody
course
have a great
testing.
answer? I mean,
End of course testing is,
Let's
it's
say
not
there's a
required to
problem.
pass.
Yeah, right.
Well, and your level of rigor, when you require everyone to take it, we just went through the course code project, as you all may remember, and we eliminated all of the extra courses that were not. So what we took is we took our codes and aligned them to our standards. Right. And so what happened is that there were lots of codes that called it Gateway to Algebra 2, Algebra 2 Advanced, Algebra 2 Regular, Algebra 2, you name it. And so what was happening is that the level of rigor of standards that should have been taught were not fulfilled because they all.
You could basically call anything Algebra 2.
There are set standards for it, but not, yes. And it does not take away the flexibility for, as Dr. Lewis said, for districts to require it. You know, some can say, we require our district at their local level to complete that credit. And if that's what they choose, they absolutely have the flexibility to do so.
Yeah, well, hopefully those days of playing that charade are going to be over.
And I'll be honest, Rich, I'm pretty sensitive about the idea that anything that we're proposing is lowering the bar. Mm-hmm. Because that is absolutely not what we're doing. What we are proposing is raising the bar to a level that it has never been in this state before. What we are proposing is eliminating the days where we say one thing, but the reality is something completely different. When we grant a high school diploma to a kid in Kentucky, regardless of where they graduate from, we're going to have some basic assurances about what that kid's skill level are and that he or she is prepared to be successful in that next step in life.
And there is no action on this, by the way, today. It will come back to us in October. But want to make sure we all have the opportunity to talk about.
So I asked Dr. Lewis a question, I think it was last meeting, are the standards going to be at a higher level than, and you guys have heard me ask this before, a GED? And he's like, there's no doubt that it's going to be higher. And I can guarantee you that right now, graduates are not at that level.
Right.
So that made me feel comfortable that what's going on is at a level that's going to be significant. And then to the point earlier, you know, there probably is going to be a drop in graduation rate. And
that's been the concern. You know, when I've gone to co-ops or advisories, it's not. There is definitely no concern around lowering the bar. It's the concern about really stepping up into ensuring that students successfully graduate with the expectations of the foundational exam in reading and mathematics and the transition readiness piece, because they realize it's for the all. And we talked about that. I mean, there are some very rural areas who said, well, I don't know that I can get some of my students there. And I said, exceptional work exceptional work experience, credentials. We should be focusing on that for everyone. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, not just the handful, but the all. And that's the biggest concern I've heard. They have not pushed back on the requirements. They can't refute them, really. But they feel challenged, and they feel challenged about the individual personalized piece, because that's what they want to do, make sure that it's individualized, but they have to think differently about how they approach that. And that's where we've had the concern, if you would say.
So the next question I would have is, how does this get communicated to parents, to students, to teachers in a simple, elegant way, and in particular to the media, so that they don't poke you guys in the eye saying you're lowering the bar, right? When the exact opposite is true. Who's coordinating that? What's it going to look like? When's that rolling out? You don't have to answer all that now because we've got another month. But
no, it's a great question, Joe, and that is one of the reasons we accelerated the timeline for asking you all to consider the revised graduation requirements, rather than us stretching the timeline out and then asking for your approval later in the academic year. The hope was that we could get to a place where the board is comfortable, where the board could approve new requirements, and then we could immediately begin and spend the rest of the academic year communicating that in a very strategic way, led by our communications office, what those new requirements look like, because they will take effect for freshmen entering next year.
And the scheduling season will be soon after that. And so we want it to be relevant, timely, and so they have time to prepare, but think differently. It matters. And so we're already thinking ahead on that.
beautiful, thank you.
Yeah.
And I just had one comment actually, which, of course, the Kentucky public school system has a lot of work cut out with my son. I told Joe that he is in 3rd grade and plans on playing in the NBA, so.
All right.
Do a little career exploration with Jay, but anyway, going back to the whole idea, I am super supportive of career exploration falling in the hands of local districts, because in my mind, as a business community leader, I want to see my local school districts helping that career exploration kind of encourage our labor needs for our community.
Absolutely.
So to me, that's where it probably should be. So just
Thank you.
my 2 cents.
Yeah, thank you.
Would you go ahead, Lisa.
I want to make a comment first, and I do have a question. I had the opportunity to participate at the SOAR Summit last weekend in Pikeville. And while I was there, I had the opportunity to meet a lot of the local children, school children. They had bused them in from different counties. And we had an additive manufacturing setup, and they were really interested in it. A lot of them had never seen 3D printing before. And what was interesting to me, I think there is a hunger now with those students, because while I was there was these 2 sweet young ladies that came up to us and were asking us and inviting us to a career fair that they were pulling together for their local high school, which kind of shocked me a little bit, because I guess I'd always thought that lied, that responsibility may or should lie with the administration and the teachers and stuff there. But the kids were actually trying to pull together the career fair, because they said they'd never had one before, and that they really wanted to know about what opportunities were out there. So on one hand, it was exciting to see the interest, and they were all excited, and they really wanted this technology to come in there to share that. But the other side, it was kind of sad to see, we still have a lot of work to do, trying to get the schools more engaged in that as well. So that was my comment. I met a lot of wonderful young people there. The other one, we were talking about career pathways, and we spent a lot of time developing those and stuff. So with these new requirements that are laid out here, have we or will we show examples of what that might look like for different pathways? So if I wanted to go the electrical route, what might my 4 years of math, or not years, 4 credits of math look like, my 4 credits of English look like? I think for the average parent, being that I've just gone through all this with my own children, knowing, okay, this is if they want to do X, Y, and Z career, what is it going to be looking like in high school with these new graduation requirements? What would they take? And then like Hal mentioned earlier about, where are maybe the jump off points? Let's say I've decided I don't want to be this anymore, I want to do this. So have we done any of that, or will we do any of that to help educate the public?
Actually, that's one of my office priorities, is to start on that. We already have a couple in place. You saw the one for computer science that we've already got it mapped through 9 through 16. We have another model in the A to B pathway in nursing, making that a more efficient path rather than spending another $20,000 and 140 credit hours to get a 120-hour degree, by moving back and showing where those dual credit courses can begin in high school, both academic and career oriented. And to the Algebra 2 argument, if you have a son or a daughter that wants to be an engineer, one of those courses could be that Intro to Engineering, and the math rather than Algebra 2 might be Calc 1 and Calc 2, and physics and those kinds of things. And this opens the door for every career. And as the commissioner keeps talking about, it's not about CTE, it's about kids having a career. Every course that we take in high school, regardless of where you land, if we can be intentional about those courses, that gives them better opportunity for success. Right. So we've got a couple as models, and we are going to, with the Mayor and Mayor project last year, there was a lot of pathway work done, and all of these have off and on ramps to where you can leave it with an M&A and life happens. Maybe 2 years later you go back and get the LPN. Or with this aggressive model, they could have an LPN really 1 semester out of high school. But that's not for everybody. So we want to take that most aggressive approach and then show opportunities for that student that is not ready as a freshman, maybe as a sophomore, junior start, or maybe even a senior after they've taken machining and they decide they want to be in healthcare. I've got a welding teacher that has a RN. He's an RN. So it happens. And we're aware of it.
So to Elisa's question, where do the parents, say middle school kids, go to find this information? Because they may want to just examine what their kid is saying and look at opportunities for them through middle school and on into high school, so they can essentially be a counselor in some fashion because you've educated them. Is this online? I mean, is there...
So I would say, Kathy, one of the things to keep in mind is, our resources and the types of pathways that David is talking about is first and foremost, I think, for districts. Because, at the state level, again, we set minimum high school graduation requirements. And David is constructing these pathways in terms of what they can look like. But districts then have the opportunity, local boards have the opportunity to decide what they're going to do at the local level. So at the parent level, my recommendation to the parent would be to look first to district resources and district guides, because if your initial go-to is at the state level, we could miss something in our effort to communicate broadly to the whole state that is a requirement or a resource that's at the local level for the parent.
So what are districts doing to address this communication?
Well, districts, first of all, have to get what you approve. And so again, it's kind of the imperative to get this approved, get the board to approve something so that we can move forward with communications. And that districts, I expect there are going to be local boards of education after the state board makes a final approval. Local boards of education will convene and then decide how they're going to tweak their own local high school graduation requirements.
Yeah. And then that even works down into site-based or the school-based decision-making councils to determine courses offered to fulfill those pathways or how to help meet those requirements. So it's really a trickle-down of decision-making and how to communicate that and what they offer, what they can offer, what they give up, and what they add on. I mean, there's some big decisions, but that's exactly where that would come from.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask a question? How advanced are we with all these career readiness? I know we're talking about changing careers and career path, but when I'm sitting here listening and I'm hearing all of this, when I look at reality, some of the stuff we're talking about is almost 30 years old already, and we just now talking about plugging into it. The children that are getting ready to start to school or started to school this year, what does it look like for them? You see, right now, I work with certain groups, and they talk, working with the Department of Defense, and, you got drones the size of insects. We can go to the doctor without going to the doctor. Just dial up the phone, pull my iPhone off, and he can tell how I slept last night. And all of these careers that we're looking at, are we keep peeling the onion? Are we still staying in tune? What I'm saying here right now is that we're getting to the place that we're going to have to recruit people from other countries and other places. What are we doing to make sure that we're staying in front of this moving world? I don't want to sound like a prophet of doom, but I do want to feel like we are moving in the right direction. We stand here and we're studying about where we are now, but how are we going to get the new class of 2030 or wherever they are, where they're going to be with jobs? Just like now we're discovering that our schools, we're 30 years behind in some things, and we're trying to move in this 21st century, and that's where I'm looking at. I don't know how much time I got left here, but I do want to feel like that the new generation is going to have our advancing. Are we staying on top of this, even right now as a board? Are we looking farther than just trying to get these scores up? But will our children be ready to get the jobs? Like right now we're talking about these jobs. But the new generation, are they going to be able to get these new jobs?
So I believe that that's a great question. There's still, back to the question of equity, the issue of equity that we've talked about in the previous conversation. it surfaces here again. Because the reality is the opportunities kids are provided across the Commonwealth, they vary considerably depending on the school district that they're in. So I give you an example. In Fulton County, in Four Rivers ATC, they were a recipient with their region of the Work Ready Skills Initiative and used those grant dollars to really purchase a lot of equipment that put them on the front lines. I mean, really the cutting edge in terms of the technology that's available. I give example their auto mechanic program. The instructor there was telling us when we visited that some of the local shops would send folks there to train because the technology that they have is more advanced than what's in the shops. And in other places where they've had access to resources or through Work Ready Skills Initiative, they've been able to really get right to where what they're providing is no different than what a student is going to experience in the workforce. We were in Jessamine County just last week where they've started a new diesel mechanics program, where they've renovated their bus barn, where students are actually working on school buses. And the teacher was saying, to your point, you know, people's idea of what diesel mechanics do is very different than what they did maybe 20 or 30 years ago, because a considerable portion of the things that they might diagnose and fix, they're doing through computer programming without ever even having to get their hands dirty. So there are those types of examples in the Commonwealth. There are also examples at our ATCs and in some of our school districts where the equipment that they're working on is 30 or 40 years old. So we do have a lot of really important work to do to ensure that kids in areas where resources are not as plentiful, where we provide more opportunities to those students. In some cases, it's going to take more resources. In some cases, to be honest, it's going to take us just being more creative and more innovative and recognizing that regardless of where a kid comes from, that they should have the right and the opportunity to pursue these types of career pathways.
Dr. Lewis, I'd like to add to what Vice Chair Seymour mentioned, and I know there's been some numbers circulating. They've changed, not sure of the exact number today. One number I saw was that only 42% of our high schools offered any type of computer science or IT course. I might have been misinterpreting that, but less than half of our high schools offered anything in the technical areas that Vice Chair was talking about. Maybe just as an information item, I don't know if we can get together for October, if we can't by December, but just kind of a state of where our high schools are in Kentucky on making available to their students, not that we're requiring it, but making available to their students that they could take a computer science course or an IT credential, but some kind of state of IT availability in the high schools in Kentucky, I think would be helpful for us.
We can definitely do that. We can definitely do that. And that's, I'll tell you, it's an area where in the last couple of years we've actually made some advances. If it is approaching 50%, that's not where it was not too long ago. We've had a real concerted effort over the last couple of years to increase even access at the elementary school level in training and preparing teachers to be able to get kids engaged in learning about computer science at the earliest levels.
Just the technological expansion now, it's really an explosion. And you know, our district's response, I think, would be real important for kids that'll be out here in a few years. Kathy?
Yes, Dr. Lewis, I want to say that to me, and also I want to say this to Vice Chairman here, that the most important thing that I think you are proposing here is that the high school diploma guarantees us of something, which to me is so foundational. I wish that I were starting my company now and having graduates coming to me that I could hire with that assurance. Because regardless of whether we offer the computer classes or all of these great things, if they don't have their foundational education in place, I, as an employer, can't do anything with them because I don't have that remedial capability. But if they can read well and they can have some exposure to mathematics, there is so much that a student has opened for them, regardless of all these other nice things we're talking about. I'm not against those nice things, but I am so thrilled that this high school diploma is going to mean something. It is the best gift we can give to the students of Kentucky, and I'm excited about it.
You know, one of the reasons I was saying that, because, you know, anymore jumping on a tractor, plowing in the field, you got a satellite right there telling you whether you're putting down fertilizer or you're not, or what you need to do here. And the world is just changing so, you know, and that's the reason that even out there as an excavator, you got to know where to dig, how to dig. You got to have math as well. But you got to know these things, and the world is moving just that fast, and we got to be ready for it, and that's what I believe.
Yes, sir.
The cabless tractors,
Yeah.
we don't jump on them anymore.
No.
The prototypes are already out there, and
Yeah.
robotic bricklayers, it's all.
Yeah,
It's coming really, really fast. I want to make sure, there was one other topic.
Yes.
And that's, we were sort of talking about this 10th grade would be the first time we knew which students were proficient or not. Although there could be a significant percentage that were already on basic math and reading, already proficient in, take 8th grade, for instance. Would you talk to that a little bit about whether, you know, a student that didn't do well on a 10th grade test for whatever reason going on in life, whether there could be a look back to 8th grade, or just talk a little bit about your goals there?
So one of the things to keep in mind with the 8th grade proficiency, and Rhonda can definitely speak to that, but we do have standards, and we do have high school standards that progress students to have skills and knowledge in the high school level that are not taught or assessed at the middle school. And so I think we just need to be very cautious that if students are performing at the proficient level or within an appropriate level in middle school, that's exactly what we want. But we want to see them continue to grow into that sophomore, at a minimum, at the sophomore year, to demonstrate foundational skills. So I would just be really careful on that, that if they perform well in 8th grade, we want to see them continue to progress as they're learning and advancing in their education. The other thing that we want to also do is not diminish the importance of high school English courses or mathematics courses. You know, we don't want them to think, well, if they reach 8th grade, that's the best that they can do, because I don't believe that. I think we can do better. And even reaching the level of proficiency, or in the range of which they should definitely assess, we definitely want to be on high school standards. And our standards are really intentional about having that progression, really K through 12, of just building on skills. And so I wouldn't want to cut that short, because there's definitely things to learn and apply their knowledge at a higher level, definitely when they get into the high school. I know, Rhonda, you probably have
Sure.
experienced some things as well.
Just one thing I would add, federally, we have requirements around the assessment. And we do need to assess the standards of the grade band. So if we're in high school and we have those high school standards, then the challenge is that we need Kentucky teachers to build a test that measures those high school standards. Now, in terms of coming up with a passing point for that assessment, you know, our assessment will need to do kind of multiple functions. It'll need to still give students information around novice, apprentice, proficient, distinguished. That's a federal requirement. But then we'll need to set that point of passing on that high school assessment that we say is that minimum standard, that minimum cut. Certainly there are some psychometric things we can do and look back at performance at 8 and correlate the two assessments. So there are some things we can do psychometrically there that we can explore and research. But I think the message piece, having been a high school teacher in an earlier life, I think we want to clearly say the high school standards are important, continuing to grow, continuing to progress. And I think critically, we have to be able to demonstrate federally that we are assessing with every child that's enrolled those high school standards. So that would be one thing I'd want you to keep in mind around the assessment piece.
So a student doesn't meet a minimum threshold, whatever that would be, in this 10th grade assessment.
Right.
And then I think I remember from last time there would be 2 opportunities,
There'd be
11th
retake
and 2
opportunities.
opportunities in
Yes, sir.
12th.
Right.
That's right.
That's right.
And I'm guessing there'd be some intervention that would
There should be.
should be
There
in
absolutely.
11th and 12th. Any opportunities for those teachers in 9th and 10th to know which students are kind of already in trouble, that intervention could start earlier than 11th
know
and
that.
12th?
Yeah.
So they know that now.
Right.
So,
They-
I mean, you know when a student is in 9th or 10th grade, what level they scored at on their 8th grade assessment, novice, apprentice, proficient, or distinguished.
And we certainly, in reporting data to schools, I mean, as the commissioner said, they have their individual student results in August this year. And reporting, we could even flag, early warning flags. We could do some things with data to just help draw attention. Here's a student that, based on their performance in 8th grade, what would you need to get on the intervention track in high school? So we could certainly look at reporting and enhancing that in some way.
The goal is not to hold students back from graduation, right?
Right.
It's to
Correct.
get them
That's
there.
right.
So,
Right.
No, we believe when you raise the bar for students, that by and large, students will rise to the occasion and meet that bar. Same, we believe, is the case for educators and for our system.
And again, we're talking here about the standards on a state assessment and the state purpose and an accountability purpose. You know, every day, as I've heard Dr. Houchin say many times, that local activity that's going on. So every day, there's an assessment and an interaction between that teacher and the student. So really, there is a watching every day of how students are moving forward. We're just giving you some points and times looks that are consistent across the whole state. So the formative piece, I think, plays into that well as well.
and
what
this
you
is
do
not a new
locally.
test. This is already a required 10th grade test.
No.
It would
no,
be.
But it would
no.
be a
So
new-
we currently at the high school level, we give end of course assessments. So we give an English 2 test, we give an Algebra 2 test, a biology test, and a U.S. history test. This would be a new assessment.
Those go away.
Those will go
Right.
away. We're actually not administering those this year in preparation for moving to something different.
So the potential hole with this is that it's a Kentucky state-developed test where the passing requirements or the proficient, the novice, the whatever, is determined by the state, by the teachers that are going to be developing the test. So that leaves some wiggle room for how difficult it is to be considered novice or proficient.
There's still validity testing
There's
and
there's
field
still,
testing.
right, it's an industry standard. Even if you have Kentucky teachers involved, there'd be a very systematic process, very similar to what Brian and Chris talked about today applied to accountability. You apply that to each assessment. So many states do custom assessments. This year, we've used the ACT at high school to kind of fill the void of this transition, and we'll need to use that one more time moving forward. But at the same time, just because it's Kentucky produced doesn't mean it isn't a good, solid measure. you
Yeah,
know.
I'm just saying there's some room for it to drift a little in my mind. Maybe I don't understand it well, and we can talk later.
Our psychometricians would want to ensure that there isn't drifting. You don't want your standard to
Right.
drift. Yeah, and so, you know, you wouldn't want the standard drift. It's the same thing you'd use in an industry standard about something in your business world. But you would be making sure that with the psychometric support and the testing expert support, that you're not seeing drifting along the cut, because you don't want your standards to change. And you certainly don't want your measurement scale to drift either. So I think it's a very valid concern to raise, but we'd want to make sure we have the psychometric folks to be able to really confirm that it's not drifting.
So that would mean that right now, if the test had been developed, right now, 40-some% would not pass it.
We would be guessing.
Just guessing, no, I'm just saying, but the reason I bring that up is that's, as you guys were talking about the transition, that's automatically gonna mean, and Dr. Lewis, I agree, you set the bar here, people will try to get there. I think that's right on target. There's gonna be some drop from that. And the only reason I bring this point up and am so persistent about it is, we don't want to do all this effort and not have it really mean something to the colleges or the post-secondary ed or to the employers, so that when we hire someone, it's like, dang, you know, Kentucky Ed, he's got a degree, that's worth it. I'm really excited about having him join us, or her.
What I think with high school graduation requirements, what I think the post-secondary community is going to be incredibly excited about is the requirement that students be transition ready.
Yeah,
having that industry-recognized credential, completing the apprenticeship program, meeting the benchmarks on the college admissions examination. I do think they're going to be excited about the minimum standard in reading and math as well. That should be, I mean, to be frank, that should be a no-brainer for a high school diploma anywhere in America. But where I think they're really going to get excited is the idea that kids have reached some level, some standard that says that they're ready to be successful at the next level.
Okay, we good to go to October?
Yes, we are.
Discussion?
So
I think
much.
we're-
Yeah, thank you. Very
It was
well
great
done.
discussion.
I think this was I'm thankful for asking to continue the conversation on this meeting agenda. I mean, I think this conversation and this topic is so important that the more we can talk about it, the more questions we can ask, I think the better. And I think it's improving the product that we'll ultimately have. So thank you for this.
Well, let's not lose sight of the fact this is a transformational moment as I see it in Kentucky education. You made it clear last week with your State of Education address in Nicholasville that the expectations are going to change, that the days of us sitting around and patting ourselves on the back because we did CARA 25 years ago, a quarter century ago, are over. And that doesn't define success for us today when we're graduating half of our students, more than half of our students, who are not proficient in reading and math. That's unacceptable. You've made that clear.
Yes, sir.
You've changed the expectations, and I think that's terrific. And we've sacrificed too many young futures for too long around here at the altar of adult convenience, and we've got to change that. We've got to change that, and I think you've made it clear that we will.
Yes, sir. Well, we appreciate your support.
Very much
I think Tracy had a comment.
I had a comment from I guess from a parent perspective, is there's a lot of focus, which is super important, on the outcome of what we're talking about, what their career outcome will be. But I think it's a huge advantage for the students to learn the process and build a foundation on how they may or may not achieve that outcome they set out. And I think that has a huge advantage for the student. So that way, if the career path does change, they know the method in which they used to achieve that. So for me, from a parent perspective, I'm now having a child that's saying, this is what I'm going to do to plan out to try to get here. But if I choose to go otherwise, I'm confident in changing that course or that pathway from what I've learned
I think that's a
on
great
how
point.
to do that. So I think that's important, not to just focus on, if you want to be a nurse, this is where you're going to go, and it might change. Well, no, what did you learn? What did you go through on how to get there?
That's right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I think the process is huge, and I think the parents being involved, the teachers being involved, and the students all engaging in that builds that confidence. So if they do want to change career paths, they're not in the dark. Well, I want to be a nurse now, not an engineer. I don't know how to do that. You do. You learned a process, and that process will carry through. My 3 oldest that have all graduated all work in a different field, have taken a course load, a different college course load in a different field. I have a salesman that's taken medical courses in college. I have an engineer that in the military was logistics and food engineer. And then I have a wheeled mechanic in the military that's now a financial and business major. So each one of them has chosen different career paths, and you know, depending on what you choose for your career path, that might not put food on your table. So this process that they're learning in high school and starting in the middle school is to their advantage.
Absolutely.
I think that's a great point. I mean, it's a skill set that probably most of us in the room have had to use a couple times in terms of changing careers and doing different things. I heard a speaker said once, he was speaking to a group of students, but I probably took as much from it as the students, and I use this statement to kids when I'm talking all the time. High school students, I believe it is an unrealistic expectation, or college students, to know what you're going to do for the rest of your life or for the rest of your career. It's completely unrealistic to put that kind of pressure on them, but it's not unrealistic to ask students to prepare for what comes next.
That's right.
Correct.
Because if they're prepared for what comes next, once they get there, they can use this process, this skill set that you're talking about, Tracy, and put that to work again and prepare to go on to something different.
Amen.
So that's a great point. Thank you.
Excellent.
We've probably all had jobs where we're like, I don't want to do that anymore.
I do wonder.
How to get to the next
biggest-
level.
that's right.
Learn how to get to the next level.
All right, well, thank you very much. We look
Thank
forward
you.
to
Thank
the
you.
continued
That's
discussion
great.
in October. All right, next item on our agenda is internal board business, and specifically relating to board policy and committees. We have had we've set up committees a little differently than in the past, reduced the size of committees from 5 to 3. Just with people's schedules and absences, a committee of 3 has proven to be somewhat difficult to achieve. So I have asked our general counsel to prepare a policy, a board policy change, and I'll read it here. And as I looked at the board policy, they also added a technical change. So let me read this, and then we'll go from there. On page 9 of our board policy, right now it says the board chair and vice chair are non-voting ex officio members of all committees, and would suggest deleting that and adding the board and vice chair shall serve as voting members of all standing committees. That would take us from a quorum of 2 to a quorum of 3. You know that our committees meet simultaneously, generally. But the goal there would be that the board chair and vice chair would be able to fill in as people have absences or traffic problems or health issues or whatever on the committees. So that's a deletion and an add on page 9. And then there's a technical item on page 12 that currently says a fund that's established for flowers, charitable donations for planning committee members within KDE. And because that doesn't exist any longer, that's been changed to the executive leadership team, which has just been a technical change made within the department. So those are two suggested changes, and I guess now I'd entertain a motion one way or another, and then discussion. Motion to approve.
Second.
From Joe, second from Kathy. Discussion.
I think it's good.
I do too. Obviously, I do too.
There's discussion.
It's a good move. It's a very helpful move.
Yes.
Practically speaking.
All right. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Okay, passes unanimously. We have one other item. Interim Commissioner Lewis is asked to make an announcement.
Yes. Marty, is Jody here, Marty? Just
While
bear-
Marty's hunting her down, I would like to say thank you to the technical group and the board for allowing me to participate remotely, right? in
Okay.
meetings.
You
That-
felt like Big Brother.
Well, it was a little scary. I didn't want to be on the screen behind everyone, looking over everyone's shoulders, right? But I think that, that really was convenient. And I think as we start moving forward, we talk about technology and how we're using it. I think that'd be great for committee meetings and for other stuff. So thank you, everyone, for making that happen.
It was great having you here, Joe, at twice your normal size. You had a big presence in the room. You really did.
You were here.
Because he's such a wallflower otherwise, right?
Okay.
Right.
Mr. Chair, thank you for giving us just a moment. This will be the last Kentucky Board of Education meeting while Jody Smith is still with us, who is going to be retiring at the end of the month. I think most of you, if not all of you, know Jody. Many of you in the room know Jody. Jody has supported commissioners of this department for 27 years.
7 of them.
And not only has she supported commissioners, but for the last 5 months now, having the opportunity to work with Jody, I have to tell you personally, she is an incredible colleague. Absolutely incredible. There is no way that I could do this job without Jody's support.
Oh, you're gonna have to.
Yeah, Jody, you know, from day one, when I came in, I will forever be grateful to you for being the incredible professional and the incredible colleague, the support that you provided for me on a daily basis, making sure that I don't mess up too bad and that I don't forget things. And so I want to thank you, and we wanted to recognize you and just say we're going to miss you tremendously.
Well, I appreciate that, and I'm going to miss this. I'm going to miss the department, the people, and I love the work. I'm really going to miss it. And I'll come back and visit every day.
Please do.
You know, I've trained 7 commissioners.
There you go.
And Wayne has been really easy. He's learned the calendar and he does it.
But I tell her, I respond to positive reinforcement. I'll go to her sometimes and say, look, Jody, I listened, I did it.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I appreciate the support of everyone here.
And thank you so much for your service.
Thank you.
Hard to see good people go.
Okay, our next meeting of our board will be on October 2nd at 8:30 in the morning, and October the 3rd as well at 8:30 in the morning, right here in this boardroom. And at this point, there being no additional business, do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Motion from Laura, second from Kathy. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? We're adjourned.
Thank you.